Fame and Fortune Weekly, Number 9, New York, December 1st, 1905. Published by Frank Towsey. Nip and Tuck, or The Young Brokers of Wall Street, by a Self-Made Man. Chapter 1. Nip and Tuck.
Nip! Tuck! Put it there, pard! Shake, old man!
Two uncommonly bright, good-looking, curly-haired lads between 17 and 18 years of age, each with a dress suitcase in one hand, had run against one another as they were coming out of the ferry house at the foot of Cortlandt Street. They might have been taken for brothers at a rough guess, for their height, build, and general alert air was unmarkedly similar. But the guess would have been wrong, for one was Nicholas Nip, who hailed from the Bronx, where he resided in a boarding house, while the other was George Tuck, who lived with his parents in Harlem. They were old friends, and once upon a time had been next-door neighbors when they attended the same grammar school and graduated together, each attaining 98% in his class examinations. They entered Wall Street as messenger boys on the same day, Nip with Neoploy of Billings and Company, and Tuck with Bloodgood, Shipley and Company. Both at once became interested in the workings of the market, and began to speculate in a small way about the same time. But, curious to relate, in all their little dealings never were they once on the same side of the fence. If Nip was buying a stock for a raise, Tuck was certain to be selling short, or vice versa. And now, after an experience of 3 years in the street, both, unknown to the other, had branched out as a budding broker on his own account. Each had left town independently on a vacation, intending on his return to surprise the other with information that he was now his own boss. Although the best and truest of friends from a sentimental point of view, they had always been red-hot rivals on the question as to which of them was the better man. Both claimed the distinction, and it would have taken Solomon to decide the knotty question with perfect justice. If Nip got the advantage of Tuck, he did not hold it any longer than it took George to get busy to retaliate, and it was just the same the other way. So it was a constant matter of nip and tuck between the two in more senses than their names would imply. "Well, where have you been for a week back?" asked Nip curiously. "At the doctor's," grinned Tuck. "At the doctor's?" repeated Nick with a mystified expression. "What for?" "For a week back." "Oh, rats! That's a chestnut with whiskers on it," answered Nip with a snort of disgust. "Give me something new." "Sure," responded Tuck, taking a bright dime from his vest pocket and tendering it to his friend. "Here, take it." "What's this you're giving me now?" asked Nip suspiciously. "What you asked for. Something new. Just from the mint." "Think you're smart, don't you?" sniffed Nip, putting the dime in his pocket. "Well, I'm 10 cents ahead, all right." "Which shows you're a sensible chap," chuckled Tuck. "So Billings gave you a week off, did he?" "No. You don't mean to say that you've been out of town on business, do you?" said Tuck, opening his eyes. "No." "Then explain yourself." "I gave Billings and Company the shake." "No!" exclaimed Tuck in surprise. "Fact," replied Nip with a smile of triumph. "I begin business on my own hook tomorrow." "You don't say!" whistled Tuck, looking at his companion with a serio-comic grin. "So do I." "What?" exclaimed Nip, taken all aback. "You?" "Precisely. I've sacked Bloodgood, Shipley and Company, and I open an office at the New Era building on Wall Street tomorrow." "Where?" gasped Nick, almost dropping his suitcase. "New Era building," repeated Tuck. "Why, I've taken an office in that building, too." "You don't say. It doesn't seem possible for us to shake one another, does it? I'm on the 3rd floor." "So am I." "3rd floor back." "Same here." "My office is number 34. "Mine is 33. That's next to yours. Gee whiz, who'd have thought it?" "Look here, Nip. You never let on you were going into business for yourself," said Tuck with an injured air. "And you never told me you meant to branch out for yourself," retorted Nip. "Oh, I intended to surprise you, old chap," grinned Tuck. "Well, you have, all right. And you've surprised me, too. We're business rivals at last, eh?" "But we're not less friends, are we, Tuck?" "Sure not. And you won't have a pair of specially sharp shears in your desk waiting for a chance to slip my wool, will you, Nip?" asked Tuck with a wink. "No," said Nip, shaking his head solemnly. "I won't do a thing to you." I'm certain you won't, laughed Tuck, for I shall keep my weather eye lifting when you're around. I give you fair warning now to keep your wool in the safe, or it will vanish before you can say Jack Robinson. Think so? Retorted Nip sarcastically. Don't you fool yourself, George Tuck. I've cut my eye teeth. Glad to hear you say so. I shouldn't have thought so from your face. What's the matter with my face? Nothing much, only it looks easy, that's all. This is a nice way to treat an old friend, isn't it? Asked Nip. Come in here and have a cream soda. That'll be treating you better. Tuck led the way into a big Broadway drugstore. I had a fine time when I was away, grinned Nip as they slowly drank their sodas. So did I, fine as silk. I met one of the nicest girls that ever wore shoe leather. She isn't any nicer than the one I met where I was. How do you know she isn't? I'm judging from the girl I made myself solid with. Well, this girl of mine has money, said Nip with a triumphant grin. So was the one I met, replied Tuck maliciously. I mean a great deal of money. She's an heiress. Same thing with my charmer. Nip looked hard at his friend to see if he was joking, but Tuck was as solemn as an owl. Well, I'll bet my young lady is smarter than yours anyway, snorted Nip. How much will you bet? Asked Tuck, yanking out a roll. How are we going to prove the question? Said Nip, pulling out his wad. You might mention some bright thing she said or did, and if it beats anything I can offer on my Daisy's account, I'll haul in my horns. I'll go you, replied Nip briskly. The day before she left. Oh, she left before you did, eh? Interrupted Tuck. Yes, she was there before I arrived and left on Wednesday night. I did pretty well for 4 days of her society. We're even up then, answered Tuck. My young lady arrived Thursday morning, and I left her at the hotel when I came away this morning. Go on with her yarn. The day before she left, went on Nip, an English dude stopping at the hotel butted in on us, and was soon bragging about himself and family. Finally, he remarked that he only associated with his equals. And what do you suppose she said to him? How should I know? She said, Indeed, Mr. Foxglove, you should aim higher than that. Right, wasn't it? Said Nip, rubbing his hands. Pretty good, but my girl could beat that with her eyes shut. Well, show up, snorted Nip. This morning one of the boarders at our table remarked, I wonder why the Japanese soldiers carry a sewing outfit in their campaign kit, and looked at my young Judy. I should judge they use it to hem in the enemy with. She answered sweetly. How's that? Nip looked as if he was going to have a fit. Say, George, what's your young lady's name? Oh, she's got a lovely name. It's Laura. Laura? Laura what? Not Laura what, but Laura Joyce. Suffering Jew's harps, gasped Nip, staring at his friend. Is she a blonde? She sure is. How'd you guess it? And she has a maiden aunt for a chaperone. Why, how'd you know that? Don't say a word, said Nip in a hollow voice. We've both been mashing the same girl. Chapter 2. Nip and Tuck take possession of their offices. On the following morning, some of the tenants of the third floor of the New Era building, Wall Street, noticed an unwanted activity at the rear of the main corridor. Somebody's moving in, said Broker Green to Broker Brown, as they met halfway down the corridor and were obliged to step aside to allow a couple of men bearing a new roll-top desk to pass them. Evidently, answered Brown. I wonder who it is. Couldn't tell you. Let's go back and see. The other broker was easily persuaded to accompany the speaker, as he was just as curious as Green to learn who his new neighbor was. The doors of both numbers 33 and 34 were ajar. Glancing into 33, the brokers saw only a small hall room with one window. It looked out on the open space, or well, in the center of the building, provided to emit light and air to the inside offices. A man was tacking down red carpet of a neat pattern. A desk was in position, 3 chairs were huddled together in one corner, and 3 or 4 steel engravings were suspended against the wall. A painter had just finished lettering the frosted glass in the upper part of the door with the legend, Nicholas Nip, stockbroker. Nicholas Nip, exclaimed Broker Green. Never heard of him, have you? The other broker shook his head and remarked, There seems to be 2 of them, and pointed at 34, where a painter was just completing the K in George Tuck. Both of the brokers then looked into room 34 as the men came out, who had just left the desk, and they saw that it was fitted up in a somewhat similar style, except that a rug took the place of the carpet, and the pictures were watercolor instead of steel engravings, and there was a revolving bookcase beside the desk. By this time the painter had finished a capital S and began a small T under the tenant's name, which led Green to remark, "Another stockbroker. Newcomers to the street, I apprehend. We must make their acquaintances, Brown. Perhaps we can give them a few wrinkles in the business, and incidentally coax some of their dollars in our direction," with an intelligent grin which his companion evidently appreciated. "Not a bad idea, Green. I've got a few thousand shares of stock I'd like to get off my hands. None of the boys seem to want it, so perhaps I can induce Nip, or Tuck, precisely, to take the stuff." The brokers laughed and then walked away to attend to their own business. Hardly had they disappeared down a side corridor before the elevator dumped a young fellow, as chipper as a 2-year-old colt, out on the third-floor landing. It was Nicholas Nip, and he started down the corridor as if he had springs on his soles. He stopped in front of 33 and regarded the sign on the door with great satisfaction. Then, as his attention was naturally attracted to 34 by the presence of the painter, he frowned disapprovingly at the sight of the name of his particular friend and rival. "Seems to me Tuck imitates everything I do. I wonder how he tumbled to the fact that I was going into business on my own hook. He must have done so, else how comes it he hires an office for himself in this building and right alongside mine? I wouldn't be surprised if he was to bore a gimlet hole through the wall to see if he couldn't worm out some of my secrets. Tuck is a mighty good fellow socially, but when it comes to business—" "Hello, Nip!" exclaimed a cheerful voice at his elbow, and the young broker whirled around to find himself face to face with Tuck. "Admiring my sign, eh?" "Not by a jugful," growled Nip with a frown. "I was admiring my own." "I don't see much to admire about it," retorted Tuck with a grin. "Nip is a rather insignificant name when you come to think of it displayed in gilt letters on an office door." "Is that so?" snorted Nip. "I suppose you think that Tuck is ever so much better, don't you?" "To be perfectly frank with you, old fellow, and without the least desire to hurt your feelings, I am compelled to say I do," chuckled Tuck. "I'll bet Nip, signed to a check, will command more respect and attention than Tuck any day." "Name the amount and I'll sign you," spoke up Tuck briskly, flashing out his wad. "Oh, this is one of your tricks to find out how much capital I have. Well, it won't work." "Your capital won't? Well, I don't imagine it will after you've taken a lesson or two from me. Now, my capital is already at work. I bought 1,000 shares of—" "Yes?" cried Nip, becoming suddenly interested. "A certain stock and a first-class tip I got. I'm in for a rise." "What'd you say the name of the stock was?" asked Nip innocently. "If I were to tell you, you would know as much as I do about it, wouldn't you?" "Oh," said Nip, much disappointed at his failure to catch Tuck off his guard. "If I had a sure tip on a stock, I wouldn't think anything of sharing it with an old chum like you, George." "Sure thing," retorted Tuck sarcastically. "You could knock it into my office quick enough to divide it up. Say, Nip, do I look like an easy proposition?" "Tuck," said Nip solemnly, "once upon a time we swore that our friendship would be as firm and lasting as that of Pylades and Orestes." "Or Damon and Pythias." "Cert, if anybody but George Tuck attempts to do you up, let me know, and I'll be down on him like 1,000 a brick." With these words, Tuck marched into his own office to see how far advanced the furnishing of it was. Apparently everything was satisfactory. He unlocked the desk, opened the several small packages of account books, stationery, and printed blanks, and proceeded to put things in shape for a possible customer. And Nip was going through the same sort of performance in his office. "All I need now is a safe and an office boy," mused Tuck, and similar thoughts were at the same time coursing through Nip's mind. Tuck made a memorandum of the fact that he had bought that morning 1,000 shares of PD&Q at 40. "I collared the stock because I saw Astorbilt, who was a director of the PD&Q, go into Bloodgood's and stay a while. Then I followed Bloodgood to the exchange and saw him start in to buy PD&Q right and left. I've worked long enough for Bloodgood to understand some of his tactics. That stock is going up as sure as my name is Tuck. I never knew Astorbilt to call him my old boss, but something was doing in his western road." To buy 1,000 shares at 40 on a 10% margin at his bank, Tuck had to put up $4,000 cash, and his ability to do this showed that George Tuck, while a messenger, had been successful in accumulating a small bank account through his little plunges in the market. Singular to relate, Nip was starting into business with exactly the same bank account. Which of the two bright young fellows would come out ahead in the long run was a question time alone could answer. Before noon, several brokers who had offices in the building, and who had got wind of the new arrivals, stepped into the little hall rooms on the third floor back on one excuse or another, and made acquaintance of Nip and Tuck. They were much surprised to find that the new tenants were mere boys, and they mentally wondered how the young shavers, as they termed them, expected to do any business on Wall Street. One of the callers, named Jarius Redstone, had done considerable business with Billings and Company, and therefore recognized Nip as a former clerk of that firm. He mentioned the fact. "Yes," nodded the boy politely. "I was employed with Billings for a matter of 3 years. I began as a messenger and worked my way up to a confidential position when it occurred to me to branch out for myself. So here I am." "You look very young for a full-fledged broker." "I'm not so young but what I know how to use a wool clipper," retorted Nip, who rather resented allusions to his age. The broker laughed heartily at this, and then remarked, "I see you have a next-door neighbor who is also new to the business. Know him?" "You mean George Tuck?" The visitor nodded, and then said with a palpable sneer, "If there are any more of you coming into the street, it wouldn't be a bad idea for the exchange to start a kindergarten to teach amateur brokers the business." "Think so?" asked Nip, nettled at the broker's rude remark. "Well, let me give you a bit of advice, Mr. Redstone, and that is, don't make any more cracks like that in the future when you happen to drop in to see either me or Mr. Tuck. It's not precisely what I would call gentlemanly on your part, and we might happen to resent it in a way you wouldn't approve of. Good day." And Nip turned to his desk. "Touchy, are you?" snorted the broker, who was a big red-faced man of the belligerent type. "You'll soon have that taken out of you down here, let me tell you. It is my opinion that neither one of you innocents will last long enough in this building for the janitor to get acquainted with your names." Nip paid no attention to the man's bluster, and the broker left the office in a huff, fully determined he wouldn't do a thing to the boy if he got a chance. Chapter 3 shows how Nip got his first order and why Tuck shadowed him. Many of the messengers and younger clerks employed in the neighboring brokers' offices on the third floor of the New Era building thought the two boy brokers, as they were called, fair marks for their sarcasm. Augustus Totten, a junior clerk in Redstone's office, who knew Nip when he was a messenger for Billings and Company, thought it would be fine fun to guy Nicholas. So 3 days after the new brokers had opened up shop, Totten, followed by a couple of his cronies employed by Green and Brown respectively, taking advantage of the absence of their bosses, knocked at Nip's door, and in answer to "Come in," walked solemnly into Nicholas's sheep-shearing den. "You're Mr. Nip, aren't you?" asked Totten with a sly grin that at once put the young broker on his guard. "Yes, that's my name. What can I do for you?" "You're a stockbroker, I believe," went on Totten with a slight sneer. "I guess that's the way my sign reads," replied Nip, wondering what was coming. "Well, as we notice you're just starting in business, we thought we'd drop in and give you an order apiece to kind of encourage you." Nip now tumbled to the racket. They intended to ask him to purchase some kind of fictitious stock for them, and then give him the grand laugh. "Really, it's very kind of you to think of me in this way," he said with a glance which took in the grinning trio. "But the fact is, I don't do business with office boys." "What?" gasped Totten, falling back a foot or two, while the others began to look exceedingly foolish, not to say indignant. "I don't receive orders to buy or sell from boys, office boys in particular. You might call on Mr. Tuck next door. Perhaps he will oblige you." "Who are you calling an office boy?" snorted Augustus Totten, swelling up with righteous indignation. "Why, you're Mr. Redstone's office boy, aren't you?" "No, I'm not Mr. Redstone's office boy. I'm Mr. Redstone's margin clerk, if anyone should happen to ask you," snarled Augustus, now as mad as a hornet. "Well, don't get mad about it," chuckled Nip, satisfied that he had turned the tables on them. You had better scamper back to your offices before your bosses get on to your being away from your posts without leave. I've a great mind to bust you in the snoot for your impertinence," bellowed Totten. "I wouldn't try it, Augustus, if I were you. You might get hurt, and then Redstone would fire you like a shot." Totten took a step forward with a threatening gesture, but Nip never moved a hair. The young broker's nerve and coolness overawed Totten, and he thought better of his half-formed intention. "You just wait, that's all," he said, moving toward the door, through which his associates had already passed, glad to escape further humiliation. "We'll fix you for this." Then he shook his fist at Nicholas and slammed the door after him, while Nip sat back in his chair and indulged in a quiet laugh at the expense of his visitors. While the grin was yet on his face, there came a knock on the door, and before he could answer, the knob was turned, and Mr. Billings, his late boss, walked in. "Hello, Nip," Billings exclaimed as he walked over and shook hands with his former employee. "You've quite a neat little office here." "I think so, sir. I'm very glad to see you. Won't you sit down?" Mr. Billings deposited his 200 pounds of avoirdupois in a convenient chair. "Done any business yet?" asked his visitor. "No, sir." "Perhaps you could drive a lamb or two my way. I've a fine sharp pair of shears in my desk waiting for use." "Have you?" laughed the big broker. "I guess I'd better have stayed away." "Why so, sir?" "Because I came here to give you a little order as an encouragement. But since you've mentioned your shears, it's kind of frightened me." And the broker smiled good-naturedly. "I guess my shears wouldn't hurt an experienced sheep like yourself," grinned Nip. "But, sir, joking aside, I shall be very glad to execute any commission you may see fit to entrust to me." "All right, Nip. I want to buy as much COD stock as I can get a hold of. And as I don't want to be identified in the transaction, I thought of you, among others, who might be able to assist me." "I understand, sir. Go out on the curb and gather in as near 65 as you can get it, all the COD offered." "I'll do it, sir," replied Nip, reaching for his hat, which lay on the top of his desk. "The stock will be paid for on delivery at the Treadwell Bank. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Very well. Now let me see how much you can get of the stock, and whether you will succeed in doing as well for me as the other two brokers to whom I have given a similar commission." Thus speaking, Mr. Billings rose to his feet. "Just wait a moment or two until I get out of the building," said the big broker, as he shook hands with the boy at parting. Tuck was just unlocking the door of his office when Billings came out of Nip's sanctum. He recognized the big broker as Nip's late boss, and he wondered if Billings had come around to give Nip a lift in a business way. "It's just possible such is the fact," he mused as he let himself inside. Tuck rushed to his own door and looked out just in time to see Nip vanishing in the direction of the elevator. "He's in a great hurry, all right," thought Tuck. "I wonder what's in the wind. Going to execute an order for his late respected boss, I'll bet. Well, as business does not seem to be flowing my way in overwhelming quantity, I'll follow Nip and see if I can get on to what he's after. It may be a tip for me, and nothing would suit me better than to make a raise out of Nicholas." He chuckled softly to himself as he relocked the door and skated down the corridor just in time to see Nip catch the elevator down. A second elevator came shooting down a moment later, and he boarded it as quick as a wink. When Tuck reached the street entrance of the office building, he saw Nip steering for Broad Street as fast as he could go. Tuck shadowed his friend up to the busy and noisy group of street brokers who stood about on the opposite side of the street from the exchange. Then he watched him tackle several of the curb dealers until he saw one make a memorandum on his pad, motion to a messenger boy, and send it off to his office. "He's buying stock, sure enough," murmured Tuck. "But what stock is it?" He made a mental note of the broker who had made the deal, and then continued to watch Nip's movements. The boy did business with several of the brokers, and finally Tuck observed him in conversation with a particular friend of his. This young man also made a note of some transaction and sent it off by messenger. As soon as Nip had made the rounds of the various groups, he started for Wall Street. Then Tuck slid up alongside his friend. "Hello, Mason," he said. "Haven't seen you in a dog's age. How are you?" "Fine as silk, Tuck. How is the world wagging with you?" "Tip-top. Doing much business today?" "Nothing to brag of. Just made my best sale a few moments ago. 3,000 COD. Don't mention it, will you? Buyer may not want it known, you know. I did not mean to let it slip out, for these things are confidential." "Don't worry. I'm as dumb as an oyster on the subject." "That's right." They talked a few moments longer, then Tuck bade him goodbye. Slipping around the edge of the crowd, he began looking for the other men who had made deals with Nip. At length he recognized one, and stepping up to him, said, "You've got some COD, I believe?" "Not a share," replied the broker. "I was told you had," said Tuck in a tone of conviction. "Who told you?" asked the broker sharply. "You know Mason, don't you?" "You can go back and tell Mason I just sold out all I had, understand?" "All right," answered Tuck, driving toward the outskirts of the group. Then he saw another of the brokers who had done business with Nip, and by adroit methods managed to find out that he too had just got rid of all his COD. "It's clear that Nicholas is buying all the COD he can gobble, and it's equally clear he's acting for Billings and Company. Now, Billings and Company are brokers for Hoffman House, who is president of the COD. I read in the Sun a week ago that the road had been maneuvering some time to get a hold of the X, Y, and Z line, which would give them a direct connection with this city. It looks as if the consolidation was about to materialize. I'll just keep my eye on COD for a day or two and see what happens. If there's an upward movement, I'll sell out my PD and Q, which is now 6 points to the good, and go the whole hog on COD." Thus soliloquizing to himself, Tuck returned to his office, chuckling softly to himself as he glanced at Nip's name on room 33, while he was inserting the key into his own door. Nip would certainly have a fit if he knew I'd got on to his little business. Chapter 4, in which Tuck buys COD stock and gets into a mix-up with broker Savage. That evening, Tuck came down from Harlem to Proctor's Fifth Avenue Theater, and as he was approaching the entrance, he saw a cab stop in front of the playhouse, and out of it stepped Billings and Hoffman House, whom Tuck knew by sight. They entered the theater, and when the boy got to his seat, he saw the two men in a private box. Tuck watched them at intervals, and saw that they were engaged in earnest conversation most of the time. They left when the show was about half over. "Guess I can count on that consolidation," mused Tuck. "PD and Q closed at 47 today, so I guess I'll go out and get into COD before the announcement is made on the exchange and the stock commences to boom." Next morning he called on a broker named Goodwin, who had promised to allow him a certain commission on all business he brought him. "I have just sold 1,000 shares of PD and Q at 47 and a fraction through the American Bank, which bought it for me some days ago on a 10% margin. Their check for $11,000 and statement of account will reach me early tomorrow. Here's a memorandum to that effect for Mr. White, the gentleman who attends to that department in the bank. Will you buy me 1,700 shares of COD at 65, the last quotation, on a margin of 10% if I give you an order directing the American Bank to pay the money over to you? Here's $50 to make up the difference." "All right," agreed broker Goodwin, after he had figured the matter up and found that the margin came to $11,050. "Write your order, and I'll buy the stock if I can get it at 65. Buy it anyway, even up to 65 and a half. I'll make up the difference as soon as you notify me to that effect," said Tuck. "Have you a phone in your office?" asked the broker. "No, sir, but I intend to have one put in within a few days," answered the boy. "You had better call around in half an hour, then," said Goodwin, making out a memorandum of the transaction. "I'll have the stock by that time." Tuck dropped in at the appointed time and found that the stock had been secured at even 65. Well pleased at this, he returned to his office. Instead of entering his own den, he rapped on Nip's door and entered in response to the usual invitation. He found Nicholas contemplating with a great deal of satisfaction Billings and Company's check for $2,500, which represented the amount of his commission for the COD stock purchased by him for that firm. "Been doing some business, I see," said Tuck, taking a seat. "A little," replied Nip, putting the check out of sight. "So have I," grinned Tuck. "Got a safe, haven't you?" "Yes. I wanted a safe place to put my valuable papers. Mine was moved in yesterday, but I haven't anything to put in it yet. How did you know I was in, Tuck?" "Heard you," chuckled his friend. "I wasn't aware I was making any noise," replied Nip in surprise. You forgot that new scarf of yours is loud enough to be heard on the next floor." "How? Get out." "Suppose we both get out and have some lunch. I'll let you stand treat as you appear to be making all the money." As they left the office, Nip told Tuck about Augustus Totten, Redstone's clerk, and his two friends calling upon him the previous day for the purpose of having some fun at his expense, and how he had taken the wind out of their sails. Tuck laughed heartily at the takedown his friend had given them. "You let them down good and hard. Serves 'em right. Totten threatened to get back at me for it." "Did he? I guess he'll survive." "Redstone was in to see me the day we moved into the building," continued Nip. "He seems to think you and I are too young for the street. Told me he thought it'd be a good thing for the exchange to establish a kindergarten for amateur brokers like us. What do you think of that?" "He said that, did he?" "That's what he did, and I gave him a shot for it to send him out of the office looking like 7 days of stormy weather." The two boys sought a quick lunch house on Broad Street. After they had eaten all they wanted, they came out again and headed for Wall Street. As they were passing the exchange, a big man with a pair of fierce Burnside whiskers and weighing something like 250 pounds came rushing out, apparently in a great hurry. The two boys happened to be right in his path, but the man, instead of trying to avoid a collision, deliberately butted into Tuck, sending him sprawling on the sidewalk. The incident, however, resulted in further complications, which caused much amusement to the passer-by and gradually drew a crowd to the spot. Tuck, in falling, got his legs tangled up with the stout man's pedal extremities in such a way that the big fellow plunged head foremost into the gutter. "Serve you right, you big stiff," said Nip as he helped his friend to his feet. "Better sneak, young fellows," whispered a bystander with a broad grin. "What for?" retorted Nip, not pleased with the suggestion. "Your friend has upset one of the biggest guns in the street, and he'll be raising merry thunder around here in less than 5 seconds. That's Broker Savage." "I don't care who he is," said Tuck, brushing off his clothes. "He's nothing better than a loafer to knock me down in that fashion and then try to walk over me. Does he imagine that he owns the sidewalk?" "That's right, Tuck. I'll stand by you," said Nip encouragingly. Broker Savage had been assisted to his feet by a couple of spectators, and he looked as mad as a bull in a china shop. "Where's that young ruffian who tripped me up?" he sputtered, glaring around. "I'm right here," spoke up Tuck defiantly. "You want to apologize?" "What?" gasped the stout broker, almost foaming at the mouth with rage. "What's that?" "I asked if you wanted to apologize for your ungentlemanly conduct in running into and upsetting me on the sidewalk," repeated Tuck coolly. You whippersnapper! What do you mean?" A roar of laughter went up from the crowd at this sally, and the broker's face crimsoned with fury. "You young villain! You threw me into the gutter, and I'm going to have you arrested." "Just try it on. I'll bring a dozen witnesses who saw what you did to me. That'll make you take water." "Do you know who I am?" thundered the broker seriously. "I understand your name is Savage, and judging from the exhibition you're making of yourself now, I should say it fitted you like a glove." At that moment a newsboy, who had chased the stout broker's hat halfway across Broad Street, recovering it after a passing horse had put his hoof through the crown, now pushed his way forward and offered the man his battered headgear. The sight of his mutilated property so angered Broker Savage that he fetched the kid a slap across the face with his big hand, and that act removed every vestige of sympathy from his side of the case. The boy on revenge kicked him on the shins and then scooted out of sight while the spectators jeered and made various uncomplimentary remarks concerning the stout broker. A policeman was now seen approaching the crowd, which was growing bigger every moment. "We better get away from here," whispered Nip. "Here comes a cop." Tuck thought prudence the better part of valor under the circumstances, and so both of the boys began to worm their way out of the crowd. "Don't let them get away!" roared Savage, reaching out to grab Tuck. But the spectators, being now against him to a man, for many of them had witnessed the whole occurrence, they closed in between him and the boys, so that by the time the officer reached the spot, Nip and Tuck had extricated themselves and were walking off as if nothing had happened, while the bare-headed broker was making the air tingle with expressions that would not have sounded well in polite society. Chapter 5, in which Nip and Tuck make their first big haul. Some days passed before the announcement expected by Tuck was made on the exchange that the COD road had gobbled up the X, Y, and Z line, and thereby secured an entrance to New York City. Of course, when it was at last made, the stock of the former road began to boom at once, and there was a scramble among brokers to get a hold of some of it. It was soon found to be very scarce on the market, those on the inside having quietly got a hold of about all that had been floating around. This fact sent the stock kiting toward par, and the whole list was sympathetically affected, so that the bulls were having things pretty much their own way. Nip, whose tendencies were generally of the bearish order, having discounted the situation in advance because of the knowledge which had come to him through his connection with the deal, changed front and bought D&G to the extent of his pile, on the recommendation of Mr. Billings, whose knowledge of the Hoffman House syndicate plans enabled him to judge what other roads would be most favorably affected by the advance of COD. Thus both of the boys were interested in the rise, though neither said anything on the subject to the other. The papers were now full of good things to be picked up in Wall Street while the boom lasted, and consequently the public, or lambs, as they are facetiously called by the brokers, flocked in droves to the financial district with the savings of months, out of which many of them expected to realize easy fortunes. This made business lively and prosperous in Wall Street. Thousands of shares exchanged hands every day now. That meant extra clerks and overtime generally. After dark, electric lights glowed from hundreds of windows that heretofore had shown no signs of life at that hour, and in a general prosperity Nip and Tuck came in for a small share outside of their own particular little ventures. Both had a standing advertisement in 2 or 3 New York dailies which had extensive out-of-town circulation, and in consequence many commissions came their way from strangers, which they executed with an honesty not always to be found in Wall Street. "If things keep on this way, Tuck," said Nip one evening as he ran against his friend in the elevator on his return from supper, "I'll have to get a larger office and employ my own stenographer. Things are getting pretty cramped with me. My office boy is such a fat little monkey that between the both of us we quite fill the room. If I had 2 customers call at the same time," he added with a grin, "I'd have to place a chair for one of them out in the corridor." "Glad you're doing so well, Nip. You can have my room next week, as I have taken Jokum's suite out front from the 15th Institution," said Tuck, looking patronizingly at his companion. "You haven't," gasped Nip, stopping stock still in the corridor and looking at his friend as if he believed he must be joking. "Ask the janitor if you don't believe me," replied Tuck with a cheerful smile. "Business is simply piling up on me at such a rate I had either to move or be swamped. You needn't send your typewriting upstairs after this. I've engaged a shorthand artist and Remington manipulator that will do it for us both." This was a bitter pill for Nip. The very idea that Tuck was forging ahead of him was a disquieting reflection. He really could not understand it, but he put the best face on the matter he could. "I've been looking around a week myself for better quarters in this building, but there didn't seem to be anything vacant. How'd you happen to get Jokum's room?" "Just as soon as the announcement of his death was circulated, I interviewed the janitor to see if the rooms would be vacated or not, and when I found that they would be, I grabbed them. Since then there's been a score of applications for the suite, and when it came out that I had them engaged, I had a dozen offers for my option. But of course I wasn't letting a good thing like that slip. Well, there's a door between your present office and mine. I'll take your place until I can do better. After all, it isn't the show one makes so much as the business one does, eh, Tuck? Is that a crack at me, Nip?" "Not at all, unless the cap fits," laughed Nip as he entered his den, leaving Tuck to do likewise. Next morning Nip found a letter in the mail from his country girl, Laura Joyce. Not only was he delighted to hear from her, but an enclosure gave him great satisfaction. It was an order for him to invest $500 for her to the best advantage in stocks, and it was accompanied by a check signed by her aunt, who was her guardian. He would not have felt quite so happy if he had known that George Tuck next door had received a similarly worded letter with a like enclosure, requesting the handsome young broker to invest the amount of the accompanying check as his judgment dictated, also signed "Very sincerely yours, Laura Joyce." Both young brokers patted themselves on the back and hastened to do the bidding of their fair Laura, and, funny to relate, both of them bought 100 shares of the same stock, M&N at 48, for Miss Joyce's account. On the 15th of the month, Tuck moved into the late Mr. Jokum's small front suite overlooking Wall Street, while Nip, not being able to do better, added Tuck's former quarters to his own. Nicholas declined Tuck's friendly offer of part of the services of his new stenographer, a pretty little blonde of 17, and installed his own private shorthand operator, a handsome brunette of 18. I'm not going to let Tuck blow over me any more than I can help. I might have had Jockham's office myself if I had known about it in time. Well, I'll bet I'm going to do as much business as he is just the same. I guess I need a bookkeeper. He advertised and hired one next day. I guess I've got one point on Tuck all right. But when he met his friend going to lunch, he told him he'd hired a bookkeeper on account of rush business. He found Tuck had employed one himself the day before. Nip's messenger was short, fat, and 14. Tuck's was tall, thin, and 15. The pair had imbibed a mutual contempt for one another, and were always scrapping when they met, either on the street, stairs, or in the corridor, and Nip and Tuck had their hands full trying to keep them apart. Clarence Pratt, the fat boy, generally got the short end of the mix-ups, and for all that, he was too spunky to give in to Peter Klein, the thin youth. "A broker's office is no place for you," he sneered one morning as he ran against Tuck's messenger. "What do you know about it, you animated billiard ball?" jeered Klein, scenting trouble as usual. "Whoa!" retorted Clarence. "If I had your face, I'd hire myself out to an undertaker as an ornament for a hearse." "You would, eh? You're too lippy altogether for a kid of your age." And he gave the fat boy a sudden shove. They happened to be near the main stairway, and Clarence lost his balance. The stairs were of polished marble, and the fat boy rolled down them slicker than greased lightning. There were 10 steps, and then a turn. As he slid around the curve, he struck the legs of a tall, ministerial-looking gentleman in a close-fitting Prince Albert and white choker, who was slowly walking up with the gravity befitting his calling. In another moment, the atmosphere in that particular locality was filled with a mixture of arms and legs as the reverend gentleman turned a complete somersault and lighted on the small of his back, while Clarence, hardly retarded in his flight, continued on to the landing of the floor below, bouncing into the arms of the assistant janitor of the building and frightening that individual most to death. Clarence, feeling there was trouble in the air for him, scooted for the next flight, and was running up the street a moment later on the errand upon which Nip had dispatched him. As for Peter Klein, he sought the cover of Tuck's office in a hurry. The minister picked himself up, and, finding no bones broken and the cause of his mishap nowhere in sight, continued on his way to Redstone's office, where he was bound with a part of his salary to buy a certain stock somebody had assured him was a winner. That same day, Tuck sold out his COD holdings at 110, making a profit of $45 on a share. As he had bought 1,700 shares, his profits, not counting the commission due his broker, was $76,500. And the next day, when he deposited his check in the bank, the balance mounted to $87,000, a very respectable capital for a young broker to accumulate in a few weeks. He also had Miss Joyce's 500 shares of M&N disposed of at a profit of $6 a share, notifying her that her balance in his hands was now $3,375, and asking for instructions as to what he should do with it. Nip's profits on D&G, which he had sold the day before, amounted to $36,000, raising his bank account to $43,000. He also had Miss Joyce's stock sold out at the profit of $5 a share, and he wrote her that he held the sum of $2,875 subject to her order. So between her pair of admirers, the young lady had realized a profit of over $5,000, after all expenses had been deducted. "Aren't they just too delightfully smart for anything, Aunt Phoebe?" she remarked to her guardian and chaperone the day she received the letters from Nicholas, Nip, and George Tuck. "But they didn't send you the money they say you have made," replied the maiden lady cautiously. "Oh, I don't want it back. I'm going to leave it with them so that they can make some more with it," she cried in ecstasy. "Why, Mr. Tuck says he made over $75,000 during the recent boom in Wall Street, while Mr. Nip has cleared $35,000. It won't be long before both of them are millionaires." When her aunt left the room, she stood the photographs of the two boys up in front of her on the dressing case and began to wonder which of them she liked the best. "Aren't they just too handsome for anything?" she mused. But just then the bell rang for supper, and so she left the question undecided for the present. Chapter 6, in which Nip lays a trap for Broker Redstone. After Tuck got rid of his COD stock, it still continued to rise slowly until it finally touched 121, and the boy figured that he might have easily made $15,000 more if he had held on a week longer. "I don't care," he remarked to himself as he scanned the high water record reached the previous day by COD. "I've made a good haul out of it. The man who is hoggish and reaches out for the last cent generally gets caught when the bottom falls out, and then he has nothing to blame for his ruin but his greed. 110 is a pretty good figure for the stock to reach, even under the circumstances, and I could not afford to run any more risk of getting on the toboggan and sliding back." During the week, the continued strength of COD around 121 held the market good and stiff, and the lambs cavorted around the financial district in a state of high glee, for most of them had made money in the recent rise. What the syndicate at the Bank of COD was doing no one seemed to know, though many of the wise ones believed the members of the combination were quietly unloading on the public at an enormous profit. Tuck himself, believing that the boom was good for a couple of weeks longer at any rate, took a flyer at A, B, and C at 60, buying 1,000 shares outright, for which, of course, he paid the full sum of $60,000. "I've no margin to be wiped out, at any rate. That's one satisfaction," he said as he put the stock away in his safe. "The market is too high for me to take any desperate chances for a big winning. As soon as this stock goes up 5 points, I'll sell out." It went up to 64 7/8 by Monday, and Tuck was standing by his indicator with his hat on, waiting for it to go up the remaining fraction of a point, when the first signs of the impending slump of the stock market began suddenly to appear on the tape in the shape of a sharp decline of COD. The instrument began to click furiously. Other stocks also began to show a falling off, and the next quotation of A, B, and C indicated a drop to 64.5. "Gee!" exclaimed Tuck. "I'm afraid this looks squally." It might have been fancy, but from that moment the sharp click of the indicator seemed to have taken on a different tone. As a matter of fact, it is asserted that there is a difference in tone in the little instrument between the rising and falling market. One accustomed to notice it can tell the tendency of prices by the sound alone without examining the tape. When prices are advancing, it has a sort of joyous tone. Quotations are made with frequent pauses between, but the ticking is confident and pleasing. When things are panicky, sales are made with great rapidity, and the ticking is nervous and without cessation. Tuck watched the tape in hopes that the slump might only be a temporary one, but as time went on there did not seem to be any improvement in the outlook. He rushed over to the gallery of the stock exchange, and when he got there, he found a crowd of more or less excited spectators looking down on a seething mob of howling brokers on the floor, who seemed to have all at once gone mad. "But gee!" cried the boy, "I believe the bottom has really dropped out and things are going to the dogs." The excitement had extended to the street brokers. Tuck offered his 1,000 shares of A, B, and C at 64, and then 63 7/8, and so on down to 60 before he got a buyer. "By George, I guess I'm lucky to get out of that," he said as he handed a memorandum to the other broker and then hurried back to his office. And Nip, what had he been doing the past week? Don't mention it. Nip was in his glory. He had scooped in $102,000 on 3 deals, which had resulted in a loss of $35,000 to Jarvis Redstone and $23,000 between brokers Green and Brown, that gentleman's particular friends. Nip was simply tickled to death over the transactions, not only because he had more than doubled his capital, but because he had been successful in getting back at Redstone for the kindergarten insult to himself and Tuck the day they moved into the building and began business as stockbrokers. And this was how the scheme worked itself out. The morning of the day COD touched 110, at which figure Tuck sold out his holding in the stock, Nip was coming up in the elevator of the New Era building along with brokers Green and Redstone, neither of whom had been very friendly with him after they found that they could not unload on him a lot of stock that remained a dead issue with them. He heard the former say to Green that in his opinion COD had reached its limit, and would surely go down, at least to the neighborhood of par within a day or so. "Gee," muttered the boy as he walked into his office, "Redstone seems to be mighty positive that COD is going to take a slump. I wonder if somebody on the inside has given him a tip, or whether he's simply figured out the matter in his own mind. If I had something definite to rely on, I'd like to call him on that. I'd give something to do him up to the tune of a few thousands, just to let him see that a kindergarten broker isn't such an easy proposition after all." The more Nip thought about it, the more eager he was to get at his more experienced adversary. "I think I'll run over and see Mr. Billings. If anybody should know about the prospects of COD, he's the man, seeing he's on the inside and is the confidential broker for the clique that has been booming the stock. The old man likes me pretty well. Perhaps he'll give me a pointer on the situation." Nip, after he had attended to such business as he had on hand, put on his hat and went over to Billings and Company's office, a quarter of a block away. Broker Billings was just on the point of starting for the exchange. He called Nip into his sanctum and asked him what he could do for him. "Mr. Billings, I'd like to ask you a question about COD stock." "All right," answered the big broker. "I'm ready to listen to you." "Do you think the stock will go much higher than present quotations?" "Are you thinking of buying some of it at this stage of the game?" asked the broker, looking hard at his former employee. "To be perfectly frank with you, Mr. Billings, I'm on the warpath for the scalp of a certain broker who offered a gracious insult to me and my friend Tuck the first day we began business. He intimated that if any more amateur brokers like us came into the street and tried to buck against the regular fraternity, he thought it would be a proper thing for the exchange to start a kindergarten school for our benefit." "He said that, did he?" laughed Billings. "Yes, sir, and it would do me a heap of good to show him that an amateur broker, as he reckons us, can take a fall out of him, with all his years of experience in the market." "Do you object to telling me the name of the broker who made this remark?" "Certainly not. It was Jarvis Redstone, who has an office on the same floor with me." Mr. Billings pursed up his lips and stroked his mustache. He knew Redstone very well indeed, and he did not like him. "Well, what are you thinking of doing to get square, as you call it?" Redstone told Green this morning in the elevator as they were coming up, I was in the cage just back of them, that he was positive COD was getting top-heavy at 110, and it was his opinion that the stock could go no higher, but rather would slide back to about par at the end of the week. "He thinks so, does he?" said Billings with a twinkle in his eye. "So I should judge from his remarks," replied Nip. "Now, if I had a good idea that COD would go up a bit further, instead of going down the next week, I'd try to purchase a 7-day option on the stock from him, and if my calculations prove correct, Redstone would be apt to come out at the small end of the horn." Broker Billings regarded the bright boy for a minute or two without speaking. "And you think this is the right shop to come to for a tip, eh, Nip?" he said with just the suspicion of a smile. "It is a pretty valuable article to give away, don't you think? And some people might consider you had a good nerve to come in here and ask for such information." "That's right, sir," admitted the boy, looking a bit foolish as he began to consider the matter in the proper light. "Look here, Nip. I've taken a great interest in you and like to see you get along. If you solemnly assure me that whatever hint I may give you will go no further than yourself, I don't mind furnishing you with a little ammunition to fight your friend Redstone. You can depend on my word, Mr. Billings." "I think I can," replied the broker confidently. "You were the best junior clerk I ever had, and it was against my wishes and advice that you branched out for yourself. But since you've done so, I wish to encourage you all I can." "Well, thank you, Mr. Billings." "Then, if I were you, I'd risk a 7-day option on COD, but not a day longer, do you understand?" rising to his feet. "I'm very grateful to you for the hint, sir." "Don't mention it. Good day." "It is clear that things are not fully ripe yet in COD," said Nip to himself as he walked back to his own office. "It's good for a week yet if some screw doesn't come loose in the plans of the bull clique back of it. I'll call on Redstone and see what I can do with him. Oh, if I can only catch him napping, won't it be a good joke for Wall Street?" With his hat on the back of his head, Nip entered Broker Redstone's office. He was invited to enter the private room. "Well, my little man, what can I do for you?" asked the burly broker patronizingly as he looked at his young visitor like a big fat spider might a poor little fly which had entered his web. To call Nip a little man, as if he were a child, was adding insult to injury, and the boy's eyes flashed for a moment. But he curbed his resentment, trusting that the opportunity was at hand for him to square scores with the big man. "I came in to inquire if you have any COD stock on hand."
Not a share, but I guess I can get you some if you want it very bad. Do you want any?
That will depend on the price.
It's a rather scarce article nowadays, but I guess I can accommodate you with 1,000 shares at 111.
It closed at 110 last night on the board, said Nip.
I know it did, but I guess it'll go higher today, he replied craftily.
Well, I don't want any today, Mr. Redstone, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I want a 7-day option on 5,000 shares at 110. What'll you charge me for it?
5,000 shares? Exclaimed Redstone, raising his eyebrows in surprise.
Yes, sir.
And you want to buy a 7-day option?
That's what I said.
Well, my little man, pay me $2,500 cash, and you shall have it, said the broker, looking at Nip as if he regarded him as a good thing.
Very well, replied the boy quietly, rising from his chair. Please write out a receipt for the money and prepare the option. I'll be back with the cash in a moment.
Redstone nodded and watched the boy out of the corner of his eye as he retired. This is a chance I've been waiting for, grinned the broker to himself. In 7 days or less, COD will be nesting around par. What a cinch.
Chapter 7. What Nip Caught in His Trap. Nip paid broker Redstone $2,500 for the privilege of buying 5,000 shares of COD at 110 any time within the next 7 days that he chose to call for it, and the boy locked the paper in his safe with a smile which boded ill for the big operator if the market went up instead of down. "He'll never call for the stock," laughed Redstone to himself in high glee as he handed the wad over to his cashier. "For COD will never see 110 again this trip. I'm $2,500 to the good. I'd like to meet a few more know-it-alls like Nicholas Nip." And it did look, for the moment at least, as if things were coming his way, for the tape just then recorded a decline of 1/2 point in COD, the first setback it had had in 3 weeks. Broker Redstone felt so good over having enticed $2,500 of Nip's money into his own pocket that he could not help telling his friend Green about it when he met him on his way to lunch. Broker Green laughed heartily and rather envied Redstone his good fortune. "I wonder if I couldn't sell him a small block of COD on the same terms," he remarked avariciously. "Search me," replied Redstone complacently. "You better ask him. That's about the only way I know you can find out." "I guess I will," replied Green, who was quite anxious to poke his finger in the pie. So after lunch he made a call at Nip's sheep-shearing den with an amiable intention of getting some of that young man's wool himself. He was disappointed to find that the boy broker was out. "Ask him to drop into my office when he returns, will you?" he asked of the pretty stenographer. "Yes, sir," she replied, and the broker returned with hopes. 10 minutes later Nip came back from his own lunch. "Mr. Green wants to see you in his office," said Miss Parker. "Did he say what he wanted to see me about?" "No, sir." "All right," said Nip, and he wheeled about and sought Mr. Green's office in the adjacent corridor. "Glad to see you, Nip," said Green in an effusively friendly way men often assume when they have an axe to grind. "Sit down." "What do you want to see me about?" asked the boy curiously. "I understand you're looking for COD stock," began Broker Green pleasantly. "Who said I was?" replied Nip almost sharply. "Well, the fact is, I met Redstone a little while ago, and he said he sold you an option, which expires next Monday noon on 5,000 shares of the stock at 110, which is a shade above the last quotations. I thought maybe you might want a little more at the same figure." And the broker moistened his lips with his tongue in a covetous way habitual with him when angling for the wad of a client. "I hate to take advantage of your good nature, Mr. Green. COD might happen to go around the 120s by this time next week. Then where would you be?" "Oh, don't worry about me," replied Green cunningly. "I've got lots of wealth, and I'd rather enjoy the novelty of handing over a wad of it to such a bright young lad as you." "You're extremely kind, Mr. Green," replied Nip sarcastically. "Since you're so anxious to get rid of some of your money, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you $900 cash for 2,000 shares of COD at 109 1/2, the last price on the ticker, for a 7-day option on the stock." "Come now," expostulated Green. "That won't do. I want 110. "Sorry, sir, but you'll either have to take it or leave it," and Nip took up his hat. "Don't be in a rush. Let me see." He began making figures on a pad. "Suppose we call it 109 3/4. "No, sir," replied Nip decidedly. 109 1/2 or nothing." Green, who was really eager to make the deal, for Redstone had converted him to the opinion that COD had reached high water mark and must inevitably decline to or even below that par before close of the present week, closed with the boy, and in exchange for $900 in money, gave him his signed option on 2,000 shares of COD at 109 1/2. Nip's face wore a satisfied expression as he deposited Green's obligation beside that of Redstone's in his safe. "I wonder if there's any more of these people lying in wait for my wool? If there are, I should be glad to accommodate them to the limit of my pile." It happened that Brown, Green's particular friend, heard about the snap enjoyed by Green and Redstone, and he, too, hankered to get some of the pickings. So it turned out that Nip had not more than got settled in his revolving chair before Brown was announced by Clarence as messenger. "Show him in," said Nip, and in walked Brown with the air of one who had come to confer a favor on his young neighbor. "Good morning, Mr. Brown," said Nip courteously. "Good morning, my young friend," responded the broker, taking a seat beside the boy's desk. "I suppose you've dropped in to borrow 100,000 or so to carry you over the day?" said Nip with a cheerful grin. "Well, hardly," replied Broker Brown, as if he thought it a good joke. "The fact of the matter is, I understand that you're buying options of COD, and you thought you'd like to be in on the swim, too. Is that it?" smiled Nip. "That's about the size of it. Can I do any business with you in that line?" "I don't know," answered Nip doubtfully. "I hardly slept last night thinking what an easy thing I had of it with Mr. Redstone and Mr. Green." "That's a fact," replied Brown, highly amused at what he took to be the boy's nerve. "They're noted for being easy marks. Are you one, too?" inquired Nip with a grin. "Not as a rule, my little man," chuckled Brown. Little man again. That settled it. Nip shut his teeth with a snap and said, "How much do you want for a 6-day option on COD at 109? "What?" replied the broker. "Why, the stock closed last night at 109 7/8. "That's right," admitted Nip. "But you know you expect it to go down, or you wouldn't make a deal with me." "If you insist on 109, said Brown after some little thought, "I shall have to ask you $800 cash for 1,000 shares, or I'll let you have 2,000 for $1,500. How does that strike you?" "Make out your document and a receipt for $1,500, said Nip, so briskly that it almost took the broker's breath away. "Do you mean that?" he asked doubtfully. "Sure thing," replied Nip, going to his safe. "Here's the notes. Count 'em and see if they're all right." Brown did so, found they were, and handed the option and the receipt for the cash to the boy. "I guess you must have been doing well during this boom," said the broker inquisitively. "I have," responded Nip shortly. "That's why I'm so liberal with you chaps. When I get through with the three of you, I think it will do you all good to take a short spell in the Stock Exchange kindergarten Mr. Redstone recommended to the attention of Mr. Tuck and myself. Good morning. I shall be happy to see you again, Mr. Brown, when you feel lonesome and wish to get rid of some of your wool." "Well, you've got a nerve, young man." "Yes, I think I have several of them." Then Brown retired from the field, feeling almost guilty at the thought of taking $1,500 of the boy's money away with him. 3 days later, Redstone, Green, and Brown met unexpectedly in the corridor. Their faces were a study.
"Talk about hard luck,"
roared Redstone, his face the color of a boiled lobster.
"Did you ever see the like of it? That measly kid in the little room yonder has actually singed me to the tune of $35,000 on that infernal option I gave him. Why, I had to pay $117 for those 5,000 shares I've engaged to deliver at 110. I was afraid to wait any longer, for COD seems to have acquired new life, and I couldn't tell but what it might go clear out of sight. Then where would I have been?" and I'm out $11,000, for I gave 115 yesterday in order to cover my 2,000 shares of the beastly stock," groaned Green. "I'm 1,000 worse than you two with the bad," kicked Brown, mopping his face furiously and feeling as if he'd like to go to some secluded spot and kick himself good. "I bought in at 115 too." "If this thing gets out on the street, we'll never hear the last of it," said Redstone. "The boys will all say we've been bitten at our own game by a mere boy, and that we're entitled to no sympathy." "Well, it's all your fault," growled Green to Redstone. "You were so plagued sure COD was going down to par in 2 or 3 days. And I was chump enough to rush into that boy's den and bite like a famished hyena. Well, it serves us right, because we actually believe we are robbing that infant out of his cash." Just then Nip stepped out of the elevator and came along the corridor. The 3 brokers fairly glared at him. "Glad to see you, gentlemen," he chuckled, for he knew what they were thinking about. "Oh, you go to glory," growled Redstone. "You've done me up $35,000 worth, you little monkey. I'll be ready to deliver that stock to you tomorrow morning." "Thanks, Mr. Redstone, but I shan't need it so soon. I will call on you when I want it." "You mean to say you're going to make me hold it till Monday?" roared the irate broker. "It is possible," smiled the boy sweetly. "You jackanapes!" howled Redstone, shaking his fist at him. "Don't lose your temper, Mr. Redstone. You can stand the money loss all right." "None of your business whether I can or cannot." "Won't you take those 2,000 shares off my hands, Mr. Nip?" begged Green pathetically. "I've got them ready for you in my safe." "And the 2,000 you bought of me?" chipped in Brown eagerly. "Thank you, gentlemen. Much obliged for reminding me, but you know I'm not compelled to pay for them before Monday, when I shall have great pleasure in obliging each of you." "But think of the money locked up in those shares," snorted Redstone. "I had to borrow—" With that he walked off, leaving them as mad as a nest of hornets. On the following Monday, Nip borrowed the necessary money for Mr. Billings to call in the options, and immediately disposed of the stock at 121, making a clean profit on the 3 transactions of $102,000, raising his bank account to $150,000. Somehow or another, we do not say that it was Mr. Billings who gave it away, the story got on the street, and for the next 2 weeks every broker who met Redstone wanted to know how his scheme of getting the exchange to establish a kindergarten for amateur brokers was getting on. And perhaps Jarius Redstone did not have it in for Nicholas Nip after that? Well, I guess yes. As for Nip and Tuck, for Nicholas did not lose a moment in acquainting his friend with the facts of the case, they sat in Tuck's office Monday afternoon, the day of the slump in the market, and roared all they were worth over the discomfiture of Messrs. Redstone, Green, and Brown, Redstone in particular.
Chapter 8, in which Tuck has a pair of interesting callers. As we have seen, the market had enjoyed a steady rise for several weeks. Then came the break in COD, which, however, stopped around par, for the stock was too good an investment to get very far down the scale. A great many timid speculators, many with shallow purses, were frightened or forced out of the street by the bear raid. Notwithstanding this, there was some very good buying on the decline. Neither Nip nor Tuck took a hand in this on his own account, nor in the interests of Miss Joyce, whose original capital and winnings remained in their hands. The boys, fully satisfied with the profit they had made out of the boom, were contented to lay on their oars and wait for something better to come up. About 11 o'clock one morning, Peter Klein, Tuck's messenger, knocked on the door of his boss's private office. "Come in," said the boy broker, who was lazily reading the previous day's stock exchange quotations and making sundry comparison of prices on a pad at his elbow. "Two ladies, sir, to see you," said Klein with a slight grin on his usually solemn countenance. "Ask them to step in here," requested Tuck, wondering who his visitors were. A moment later Klein ushered a couple of handsomely dressed and decidedly pretty girls into his sanctum. "Why, Miss Joyce!" exclaimed Tuck, leaping from his chair as if propelled upward by a spring. "This is certainly an unexpected pleasure." "Are you really glad to see me?" she replied with a tinkling laugh, as she extended one of her daintily gloved hands to him. "Am I? Say!" "Allow me to introduce to you Miss Clark," she interrupted with a roguish glance at him. "Mira, this is Mr. George Tuck." Mira Clark acknowledged the introduction with a smile and a bow, while Tuck expressed himself as highly delighted to make Miss Clark's acquaintance. "When did you come to town?" asked Tuck after the girls were seated. "Oh, Aunt and I came back last Saturday," replied Laura with a smile. "Well, I must say it's like a ray, I should say a couple of rays, of sunshine to have you young ladies honor my office with your presence," said Tuck gallantly. "How poetical you are," laughed Laura with dancing eyes. "Isn't he?" smiled Miss Clark. "One can't help feeling poetical when he comes under the bewitching influence of two pair of lovely eyes, you know," responded the young broker. "Worse and worse," rippled Laura. "I'm afraid you're an awful flatterer, Mr. Tuck." "He certainly is very complimentary," smiled Miss Clark. "It's a gentleman's duty to be complimentary to the ladies, isn't it?" asked Tuck. "Don't you like to be admired, Miss Joyce?" "Well, now," blushed the charming miss, "you're bringing the subject right home to me, aren't you? I believe it's a weakness of our sex. But I think we might talk about something else, the weather, for instance," and she shot a sly look at the handsome young broker. "Pshaw! Anybody can see it's a pleasant day, and it is made all the brighter by your—" "Now," and Laura held up one finger warningly. "I beg your pardon," Tuck hastened to say. "I quite forgot that compliments are tabooed. By the way, did you call on Mr. Nip?" "Mr. Nip!" exclaimed Laura, looking just the least bit confused. "Sure, Nicholas Nip. He's a particular friend of mine. Told me he met you at Orangetown during his week's vacation." "Is it possible? And you know him? How very funny." Miss Joyce looked at her friend and giggled. "It must be funny if you say so," said Tuck. "But really I don't see the joke myself." "In answer to your question," replied Laura merrily, "I will say that I haven't seen him yet." "From which I infer that it is a pleasure yet in reserve for him." "Well, yes, if you put it that way." "He's a lucky boy." "You don't seem to appreciate the fact that we have called on you first," said Laura demurely. "If you only knew just how much I do appreciate it. Why—" "Now don't get conceited, Mr. Tuck. How do you know but I just tossed a penny to see which of you two gentlemen should have the honor of the first call?" "Well, if you did that, Miss Joyce, I certainly have reason to bless my luck for turning you in this direction. But I'd rather think you called on me first of your own accord." "I'm not making any confession, Mr. Tuck, so I won't tell you whether it was by luck or design that we came to see you first. You have a very handsome little office, hasn't he, Mira?" "Yes, indeed," replied the young lady, and both the girls gazed around the private office with an approving eye. "This is my sheep-shearing den," explained Tuck. "Your what?" exclaimed both of the girls in a breath. "My sheep-shearing den," replied the boy broker in an amused tone. "Pray, what do you mean by that?" asked Laura, opening her eyes very wide with womanly curiosity. "Well, you see, when lambs come to Wall Street, they always bring their fleece with them. It is a point of honor among the brokers to relieve them of their superfluous wool, as a lesson for them to stay away in the future." Of course, Tuck was only jollying the girl, as a fellow will do sometimes when it happens to hit his humor. Laura, however, looked much mystified. "I can't quite see the point, Mr. Tuck," she said. "I wasn't aware lambs were brought to Wall Street to be shorn. We didn't see a single one on the street, did we, Mira?" Miss Clark shook her head, while Tuck sniggered quietly. "Now, Mr. Tuck," pouted Laura, "I am sure you are just making fun of us. Won't you please explain the joke?" "Well, Miss Joyce, outsiders who come into Wall Street to speculate are called lambs, and the money they bring with them to invest in margins or in other methods looking to their enrichment is facetiously termed fleece. See?" "Oh!" exclaimed both of the girls together. "That is certainly much more intelligible, Mr. Tuck," added Laura, smiling. "I suppose I'm a lamb, then, for I sent you $500 to invest for me in stock, and it seems I've turned out one of the lucky few." "That's right. You will understand how lucky you have been when I say that it is clearly understood among brokers that of their clients who put up a margin for speculative purposes, 90% of them will lose it." "Is it possible?" ejaculated Laura in surprise. "It is a fact. It's not unusual practice, therefore, for brokers to copper the transactions of their customers, by which I mean that if you were to order a broker to buy for you 100 shares of a certain stock, he would sell 100 simultaneously at the same price. Instead of using his own judgment, he would depend on your want of judgment. That is, he would bet on the folly of the person dealing with him, and the wisdom and the profit of it are shown in the frightful percentage that menaces all who deposit a speculative margin in Wall Street." "That is certainly flattering to the customer. Did you do that way with my $500? "Well, no, Miss Joyce, I did not. I used your money to the best advantage my judgment dictated, for I did not want you to lose it if I could help it. But for all that, the chances were decidedly against you."
"I am very much obliged to you, Mr. Tuck, for the interest you took in my poor little investment," said Laura gratefully.
"Don't mention it, Miss Joyce. I did the same by you as I would have done by a dear sister, if I had one, which I regret to say I haven't."
"You are very good to say so," she replied, looking at him in a way that threatened him with a slight attack of palpitation of the heart.
"I assure you that it was a great pleasure to do you a favor, Miss Joyce, especially as the result was so satisfactory."
Laura smiled, but did not say anything. "I think Wall Street is a very interesting place," spoke up Miss Clark.
"Undoubtedly, to an observer."
"It seems to me that the business done down here is very like gambling," went on the young lady.
"If you sift it down, that's about what it is. That's what all speculation is. In Wall Street, it is a game of chance in 9 cases out of 10. You bet your money that a certain stock goes up, it goes the other way, and you lose. It always seems to go the other way with most people."
"But you have been very fortunate, Mr. Tuck," said Laura. "You told me that you had cleared up a good many $1,000 on the recent rise."
"That's right. But I was fortunate in capturing a tip at the very beginning."
"And I understand Mr. Nip has made a good bit of money, too, recently?"
"I believe he's done so. Did he also write you to that effect?"
"Now you want to know too much," Laura said, laughing and blushing at the same time.
"Well," said Tuck with a slight twinge of jealousy, "I suppose I haven't any right to complain. It is quite possible you may also have given him a little commission to execute, the same as you favored me with. If you did, I hope it turned out equally as lucky."
Laura smiled, but did not say whether she had done so or not.
Tuck then proposed to send for Nip, and after a slight demur on Laura's part, was permitted to do so. Nip appeared in about 5 minutes, and to say that he was surprised at seeing Laura Joyce in Tuck's sanctum would but feebly express his feelings. He was duly presented to Miss Clark, and seemed to be much impressed by her beauty and sprightliness. In the course of half an hour, Tuck proposed that they all go over to Delmonico's to lunch together. Miss Joyce at first declared that she could not think of such a thing, but Nip had made such progress with Miss Clark that Laura's objections, if she really had any, were overruled, and the quartet set out for the famous restaurant. Chapter 9. Tuck takes another fall out of Broker Savage. After a pleasant walk down Broad Street, they turned to the left, and presently entered Delmonico's. There were probably 40 or 50 brokers and other business men in the place when they arrived, and the 2 girls attracted immediate notice. Uncommonly pretty girls always do, you know. Some girls would have felt very much embarrassed under the circumstances, but neither Laura nor her friend appeared to be ruffled by the attention they attracted. Tuck ordered a first-class lunch. A few of the brokers were on speaking terms with the boys, and those nodded in a friendly way at the young fellows. They no doubt wondered who the lovely girls were.
"Do you come in here often?"
asked Miss Clark of Nip.
"Well, hardly. It isn't because we can't afford it, you know. But Tuck and I haven't gotten weaned away from our old-time quick lunches yet. I've always heard there was a great deal of money made in Wall Street, and I did think of making a little venture myself after hearing how successful Laura has been in her dealings with you and your friend. But after what Mr. Tuck said about some of the methods in vogue down here, I'm not quite so anxious to become a lamb as I was."
"What did he say?" inquired Nip curiously, believing his friend had been quizzing the girl. Mira told him as near as she could remember, and her companion laughed.
"You mustn't believe everything Tuck says," he answered with a grin. "Still, I won't say he didn't hit the nail on the head when he said speculation in Wall Street is a pretty risky matter.
Why, I've known old brokers who have spent most of their lives in the street to go broke in a single hour on the stock exchange." "Is it possible?" exclaimed Miss Clark, much astonished. "There's a heap of luck in it. Why, I myself cleared $102,000 a couple of weeks ago by working a pointer for all it was worth after I received it from a certain person." "My, how fortunate you are! And you're only a—" She was going to say boy, but caught herself in time and blushed vividly. Nip easily supplied the missing word, but though he was not any too well pleased at the suppressed allusion to his youthfulness, he laughed it off. "The gentlemen all seem to be jolly around us. They don't look as if they've lost any money lately," remarked Mira, observing that most all the faces wore a cheerful expression. "It's the way they have. You can't always tell whether they've lost anything or not. I know one broker who was hit for $60,000 in a recent slump, who, when asked how he had come out, declared he had simply coined money on the decline. Indeed, it was several days before even his most intimate friend found out that he had been a heavy loser." "I should think he would have been so upset over such a loss that he would have shown it in his face," said Miss Clark. "Not at all. It pays better to pretend you're a winner than go about kicking on your losses. You don't get any sympathy when you're out and injured, so what's the use? Every broker is trying to get his hand into your pocket, and it behooves a fellow to keep his eyes and ears open and all his wits about him in order to avoid the traps spread to catch the unwary. See the stout man over at that table? I mean the gentleman with the burned side whiskers who was talking to the little man in the frock coat?" Miss Clark said she did. "They seem to be the best of friends, don't they?" "Why, yes, I should judge they were. I wouldn't like to bet that big fellow isn't angling for the little fellow's bank account at this moment." "Why, what makes you think so?" "That's Broker Savage, and I happen to know something about his methods. That reminds me about the run-in Tuck had with him a little while ago," and he told Mira how Savage had butted into his friend in front of the exchange, and how in falling he had accidentally tripped the stout man up and sent him sliding into the gutter. "He must have been dreadfully angry," smiled the girl. "Well, say, he certainly was, but it served him right, didn't it? What right had he to bump into Tuck the way he did?" "Perhaps he didn't see him." "Oh, he saw him all right, and now Tuck is just lying in wait for a chance to get back at him. We always pay our debts, Tuck can tell you that." He started to tell her how he had avenged a kindergarten insult perpetrated by Broker Redstone, when the waiter appeared with a lunch, and after that the conversation became more general, Tuck and Laura, who had been enjoying a quiet tete-a-tete of their own, taking part in it. They spent more than an hour at the table, and the lunch was a very enjoyable one. Nip and Tuck escorted their fair companions to the Broadway cars, the girls promising to come down and see them soon again. "It isn't possible that you've actually shaken Miss Joyce, is it, Nip?" asked Tuck, fairly beaming upon his friend. "What do you mean by that?" "Well, you've been so wrapped up in Miss Clark ever since you were introduced to her that Laura didn't appear to stand a show." "What do you care, old man?" asked Nip, winking his eye. "You'd rather have Miss Joyce all to yourself than have me butting in, now, wouldn't you?" "Oh, I ain't saying a word," laughed Tuck. "It's a case of spoons between you and Mira, isn't it?" "How about yourself and Miss Joyce?" retorted Nip. "Oh, I'm Miss Joyce's broker." "Oh, so am I, if it comes to that." "But you'd sooner be Miss Clark's broker, wouldn't you, honest Injun?" "No, I'd sooner she wouldn't monkey with the market." "Oh, that gives you dead away, old man." "How does it?" snorted Nip. "Well, if you can't see how, I'm not going to tell you." And Tuck commenced to whistle. "So I've caught you at last," shouted a stentorian voice in Tuck's ear as a heavy hand fell upon his shoulder and he was whirled about on his pins like a teetotum. When the boy recovered his equilibrium, he found himself face to face with Broker Savage, who was somewhat under the influence of Delmonico's champagne. "You're an impertinent little puppy," roared the big operator, glaring at him fiercely, as if it would given him a great deal of satisfaction to have wiped the sidewalk in that particular locality with the youthful broker. "What do you mean, you big coward?" cried Tuck angrily at this insult upon him in so conspicuous a place as Lower Broadway. "Hey!" exclaimed the big broker. "You're the jackanapes who upset me in front of the exchange a few weeks ago. I've a good mind to hand you over to a policeman." "Well, why don't you? And then I'll have you pulled in, too, for deliberately knocking me down in front of the exchange on the same occasion." "What's that?" roared Savage furiously. "Who do you think you are, anyway?" sneered Tuck. "You don't own the sidewalk in front of the exchange. You're nothing but a big stuff, you know that?" "Why, you pestiferous little monkey," began Savage, making a clutch at the boy's collar, but Tuck avoided him by stepping back. "You make me sick," cried the boy, as the crowd began to collect, attracted by the belligerent attitude of the man. "You think because you're a wealthy broker that you can treat a young fellow like me just as it suits you. But I want you to understand that I have just as many rights as you have. I'm a Wall Street broker myself. But if I had shorn as many trusting lambs as you have in your time, or have had my conscience on the curses of widows and orphans whose savings have gone into your pocket, I'd go down to the Battery and jump off into the bay." Broker Savage fairly frothed at the mouth while Tuck was speaking. Then he made a furious dive at the boy, intending to annihilate him on the spot. Had he got his hands on Tuck, it would undoubtedly have gone hard with him, for the broker was a powerful man. But Tuck saw him coming in time to sidestep and let him shoot past. Clutching only at the air, the broker tried to stop his progress and turn about. He only succeeded in tripping himself up. As he fell to the sidewalk, the momentum his huge frame had acquired shot him ahead. An open coal hole in front of a big office building lay directly in Savage's path. Before he could save himself, he dove into it and disappeared, like a sprite in a pantomime, from the sight of Tuck and the spectators. Chapter 10. The Rise in Redding and Erie. "Good gracious!" exclaimed Tuck as he witnessed the catastrophe. "Come, Nip, let's see if he's hurt." The two boys rushed into the building en route for the basement as the crowd on the sidewalk closed around the coal hole and looked down into the space below. Broker Savage had fortunately alighted on top of a bag of cotton waste, and this broke his fall. But the shock was a pretty severe one to the man of his weight, and he rolled off the bag onto the asphalt floor unconscious. When Nip and Tuck reached the extension of the first cellar, they found the fireman and assistant engineer picking up the big operator. "He appears to be severely hurt," said the fireman, wiping away the blood from a cut in Savage's head. "Better telephone for an ambulance." The assistant engineer ran off to the superintendent, who was on the ground floor at the time, and the Chambers Street Hospital was communicated with. "How came the man to fall down that hole?" asked the superintendent when he arrived downstairs and looked the unconscious broker over. He glanced up at the opening in the sidewalk, which was now surrounded by a fringe of curious faces. "Where are the guards?" he demanded. "I only opened the hole a moment ago, and the man came shooting down before I could adjust him," replied the fireman. A wagon containing a couple of tons of coal stood close to the curb, which showed why the fireman had opened up the iron shutter which ordinarily covered the hole in the sidewalk. "I'm afraid there'll trouble come of this," said the superintendent in a tone of annoyance. "Lift this man and carry him up to my office." Tuck took advantage of the first chance to explain the cause of the accident. "It was all his own fault," he concluded, "and if he had been strictly sober it would not have occurred." "Give me your names and addresses, young men," said the superintendent. "There will be an investigation, and I shall want you both as witnesses." Nip and Tuck had handed him their business cards just as the ambulance drove up. The young doctor who accompanied the vehicle examined Broker Savage and said that though he was not seriously hurt, it would be advisable to take him to the hospital, and so the broker was put into the ambulance and carried away. "Savage will try to make me sweat for this," said Tuck, as he and Nip continued on their way to Wall Street. "Don't you care," replied his friend encouragingly. "My evidence will put you out all right. I guess I'll have a claim against the owners of the building for damages, for the iron guards ought to have been in place the moment after the cover of the hole was raised." The late editions of the afternoon papers had a story about the accident, and then the boys learned that the big broker, after having been patched up by the house surgeon of the hospital, had been taken to his home in a carriage. It turned out that when Savage recovered his senses, he had no recollection of his scrap at George Tuck, and the first he learned about the matter was the rather uncertain statements made to reporters by eyewitnesses of the occurrence. He did not get downtown for nearly a week, but when he did, he had Tuck arrested for assault. His own testimony amounted to nothing before the magistrate, while Tuck's and that of his friend Nip easily cleared the boy, and the case was dismissed. Savage then consulted his lawyer and brought an action for damages against the owners of the office building. The case was put on the calendar of Part 1 of the Supreme Court, and both Nip and Tuck expected to be subpoenaed as witnesses when the case came to trial, but it never did, as a compromise was effected out of court. The Redstone incident had brought Nip prominently to the attention of the street, and incidentally proved something of an advertisement for Tuck also. Lots of the brokers wanted to know the boy broker who had so cleverly outwitted 3 such experienced operators as Redstone, Green, and Brown. And now the Savage affair brought Tuck into the limelight, and quite a number of brokers, especially those who had suffered in the market through the craftiness of the stout man with the Burnside whiskers, managed to find time to drop into Tuck's office and make themselves known to the boy who had done up the unpopular operator. The result of it all was that a good deal of business came to the young brokers which otherwise they would not have got. One prominent operator who employed 6 brokers to attend to his orders walked in on Tuck unannounced one morning. "My name is Jarrett," he said brusquely as he took a chair and looked the boy over curiously from head to foot. "Perhaps you've heard of me." "I've heard of Mr. Duncan Jarrett, of number 34 Wall Street," replied Tuck, surprised to think of such a big gun of the financial district should take the trouble to call on him. "I am Duncan Jarrett, and you have my address, correct?" "I'm glad to know you, Mr. Jarrett," said Tuck with his usual politeness. "So you're the boy broker who got the best of Roger Savage, are you?" "Well, I admit we had a little scrap. In the first place, he upset me in front of the exchange because he happened to be thinking at the moment that he owned the sidewalk there and no one had any right to be there at that time but himself." Then Tuck told Mr. Jarrett the history of the trouble with Mr. Savage, including that portion of the difficulty which subsequently led to the belligerent broker almost breaking his neck by falling through the coal hole on Broadway. "Served him right," declared Mr. Jarrett in a decided tone. "I have no sympathy for him. He's a slippery proposition at the best. He squeezed me once or twice by ways that are dark, and tricks like those are a vast sin. I'm done with him. Now, young man, I rather like your face and manner. I think I'll give you a commission. I want $50,000 worth of Reading stock, to be paid for on delivery. When can you get it for me?" "I may be able to have that amount today. If not, I will have it all delivered by tomorrow," replied Tuck, overjoyed to receive such a good order from such an important operator as Duncan Jarrett. "Very well. I'll expect to see you before 3 o'clock," said Jarrett, rising. "I'm very much obliged to you for the commission, Mr. Jarrett." "That's all right," replied the operator. "And if I find that you can really do business, young man, I'll put you on my list of brokers." Then he stalked out, just as broker Redstone was passing on his way to the elevator, and that gentleman who knew the millionaire operator by sight and had often wished for a slice of his business wondered what so important a personage was doing in the boy broker's office. Tuck managed to get the shares of Reading for Mr. Jarrett before 3 o'clock, and delivered them at that gentleman's office personally. "You are prompt, I see," said Duncan Jarrett approvingly as he handed Tuck his check covering the commission. "You'll hear from me later on." A few days later, Tuck noticed that Reading was steadily advancing, and Erie seemed to be keeping it company. "I'll bet there's a syndicate been formed to boost those stocks," he said to himself when he saw that certain brokers were buying them whenever offered. "I think I'll try to get in on the ground floor myself." So he went to broker Goodwin, who acted for him on the exchange, and told him to get 10,000 shares of Erie and 5,000 of Reading if he could, on a 10% margin. It took Goodwin 2 days to get the stock in small lots, and he had to pay more and more for each block, so that it cost Tuck 78 on the average for Reading and 40 for Erie. He had to put up nearly his whole capital, about $80,000 in margins. It was a heavy risk for the boy broker, for he had no idea who was at the back of this bull movement, nor what the plans of the clique were. He found, however, in a day or two that Nip had bought some Erie, but how much he could not guess. Tuck intended to realize on Erie if it advanced 5 points beyond the price he gave for it, for he had little faith that it would be forced much higher, for never in the memory of the oldest operator had Erie reached 50. Neither had Reading been known to touch par in previous booms. So Tuck kept his eyes skinned and his wits on edge for the suspicious moment when he calculated he would unload. A week later Erie closed at 44 3/8, and Reading at 88 7/8. "I guess I'll turn the trick tomorrow," considered Tuck as he went home that afternoon. He had not been feeling well for several days, and was not in a particularly cheerful humor. Nip called at his home that evening and wanted him to go to a show, but Tuck declined on the score of a bad headache. "I hope you're not going to be ill, old fellow," said his friend with some concern. "You look bad enough to be in bed. I'd turn in if I were you. A stitch in time saves 9, or, in other words, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." Tuck thought Nip's advice good and acted on it, but next morning he could not get up, and when the doctor came he declared he had a bad attack of bilious fever. It was over a week before Tuck was in any shape to think of business. He had been out of his head most of the time, and his talk rambled upon Redding and Erie. So much so, indeed, that when Nip called to inquire about how his friend was getting on, the sick boy's mother asked him about the stock. "Well, Mrs. Tuck, if George bought any, and is holding it, he's all right up to the present time." On the 7th day of his illness, Tuck was permitted to see a newspaper, and the first thing he did, as a matter of course, was to turn to the financial news. He scanned the list of quotations on the previous day and was nearly paralyzed to find that Erie had advanced to 52. Then he ran his eye down to Redding. Some 48,000 shares had changed hands at 118. "Great Scott! Am I dreaming?" he whispered with startling eyes. But he was not. He was as wide awake as he had ever been in his life, though very shaky on his pins. "Mother, give me a pen and ink and send for a messenger boy." He wrote an order to broker Goodwin to sell both Erie and Redding at the market price, and then fell back on his pillow wondering how much he would realize by this stroke of good luck, for he did not feel equal to figuring it out for himself. 2 days afterward he managed to get down to his office. There he found a statement from his broker and a check for $396,000. His profit from the transaction had been $317,000. Chapter 11. Nip moves into better quarters, and the 2 office boys have another mix-up. "Well, old fellow," said Nip, grabbing him by the hand, "glad to see you around again. Tell you the honest truth, I felt dead lonesome while you were away." "Thanks for your congratulations, Nip. I had a bad siege of it while it lasted, though I don't think I was in any real danger of turning up my toes. I'll be all right in a day or so, and then look out for your scalp." "I'm not worried about my scalp," grinned Nip. "I did pretty well in Erie while you were in bed. I cleaned up about $200,000. "Well, I beat you by something over $100,000, and I wasn't down here either. Financially considered, it was lucky illness for me. I never would have had the nerve to hold on to those stocks as long as I had to on account of being unconscious. Now that I think of it, 800 shares of Erie belong to Miss Joyce. I risked all her booty with my own, and she has made a profit of $9,400. She's lucky, for I also put her little stake in with mine, and she came out a winner to the tune of $10,000. I guess you've made yourself solid in that direction, and I wish you luck." "How do you make that out?" asked Tuck eagerly. "I judged so because after I sent her a statement of her account, she thanked me warmly, and then directed me to turn over her balance to you, as she thought one broker was enough to handle her little business." "Is that really a fact?" ejaculated Tuck in a tone of great satisfaction. "Fact, I assure you. If you'll give me a receipt for the sum of $12,900, I'll give you a check for that amount, and you can add it to what you already have of the young ladies in your possession." Tuck did so, and that afternoon dictated a note to Laura, and enclosed a statement of her account with him to date, thanking her for the confidence she reposed in his honesty and business sagacity, and hoping to be able to call on her at her residence at an early date. That day he had another visit from Duncan Jarrett. "I heard you had been under the weather for a week or 10 days, Tuck," said the millionaire operator. "Yes, sir, I had an attack of bilious fever." "Well, you do look a little white under the gills," answered the capitalist. "I suppose you don't feel just in shape for doing business yet, eh?" "Oh, I shouldn't refuse a commission if you have come around to give me one. I guess I could manage to execute it all right," said the boy broker sturdily. "Well, if you think you're able to go out and buy me 15,000 shares of MK&T at 34, the market price, why, make a note of it. I'll pay you on delivery of the stock." "When must you have it?" asked Tuck, making a memorandum of the order. "By noon tomorrow, possible." "Very well, sir." Then Duncan Jarrett left, and Tuck put on his hat and went out to hunt up the stock. He dropped in on Nip. "I suppose you haven't any MK&T stock, have you?" Nip shook his head. "You might try Redstone, if you care to go near 'em," suggested his friend.
Tuck walked into Redstone's office and was received with a frown. "I called to see if you had any MK&T stock," said Tuck politely. "I have some. What are you paying for it?" "$34. I want 34 3/8 for 2,000 shares," said Redstone. "I can't give over 34. "Then I'm afraid we can't do business." "Very well," answered the boy and walked out. He picked up 6,000 shares from various brokers with whom he was acquainted, and then returned to his office for a rest, for he felt the effects of his recent illness. "Mr. Green was in here to see you," said his stenographer. "Said he heard you were looking for MK&T stock, and he has a small block he will sell you." "He didn't say how much he had, did he?" "No, sir." "I'll bet that's Redstone stock," muttered the boy as he entered his private room. "You wouldn't sell it to me, but he got Green to come around and offer it." The boy reasoned it out because he knew Redstone and Green were hand and glove, and he could not see any good reason why Redstone should have refused to sell him the stock at the market figure, except from a personal dislike to do business with him. After a little while, Green came in again and was shown into Tuck's sanctum. "I can let you have 2,000 shares of MK&T at 34, said the broker. "Are you selling that for Mr. Redstone?" asked the boy. "For Mr. Redstone? Why do you ask?" "Just happened to have an idea you were." "Well, no. I've had this for some days." Of course Tuck knew Green would not lie to make a sale. Brokers never do. Of course not. All the same, the boy refused to buy the stock, though he wanted it, and Green left his office clearly dissatisfied. However, Tuck felt better next morning and was able to hustle about, so he got the balance of stock for his rich client and delivered it personally on the stroke of 12. About this time, an architect who occupied a suite of offices similar to that of Tuck's on the same floor just across the corridor, decided to move to Broadway. Nip, who had fed the janitor for that purpose, got the tip and snapped the rooms up, thus putting himself on par with his friend Tuck. "Once more we are shoulder to shoulder, old man," grinned Nip, when he told Tuck he was going to move up beside him. "This is a chance I've been waiting for the last 3 months." "Now you've got it. I hope it'll make you happy," answered Tuck good-naturedly. "Oh, I guess yes," replied Nip. Next day he moved, and the occasion was signalized by a pitched battle in the corridor between Clarence Pratt, the fat boy, and Peter Klein, the thin, solemn boy, from which each retired with a black optic and several facial blemishes. "He called me an animated scarecrow," explained Klein to Tuck when the boss called him to account for the mix-up. "So I just sailed into him and made him look like 2 cents. "Clarence gave you a damaged eye, all right," smiled Tuck. "I slipped on the tiles and his elbow ran against it," was Klein's excuse. "Well, if you two don't quit scrapping whenever you meet each other," said Tuck severely, "in all probability both of you will be hunting for another job." "Well, sir, when he says his boss is smarter than mine and can give you cards and spades in the business, I can't stand it, so I've got to—" "That's all, Klein," grinned Tuck behind his hand. "You may take this letter over to Goodwin's, only don't let this thing occur again." At the same time Nip was giving his own messenger a raking over on account of the scrap in the corridor. "When you go up against Klein, you always get the worst of the argument. Why don't you steer clear of him?" "'Cause he's always cheeky to me," replied Clarence. "If you give him a stony face and said nothing, he would soon let you alone." "Well, he makes me mad. He said today that you was not in the same class with his boss, and that you only moved in these quarters for a big bluff." "He said that, did he?" grinned Nip. "Yes, sir." "And what did you say back?" "I said he was a liar," answered Clarence, rubbing his tender eye. "Then he hit you, eh?" "That's what he done, and I punched him back. But he's got arms like the sails of a windmill, and they seem to be in the air all the time." "Well, Clarence, you have to cut this exercise out in the future, or there'll be sudden vacancy in this office, and a boy about your size will find himself unexpectedly with a lot of time on his hands. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," said Clarence with apparent penitence. "Then the next time he says you're only a second fiddle to Mr. Tuck, I'm to take my hat off to him and let it go at that. Is that what you want, sir?" "Clarence, go outside and sit down," answered Nip, and Clarence went. Chapter 12. Tuck overhears something not intended for his ears, which leads to a big deal in Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock.
It was a dark November morning a few minutes after 7 that the Mountain Express on the Erie Road rolled into the station in Jersey City, and George Tuck, with a small grip in his hand, stepped off on the platform and hurried down to the Chambers Street ferry slip. The boat was not in yet, so the boy walked leisurely toward the end of the slip and finally sat down in the lee of one of the spiles. He had been up to Montgomery, in Orange County, to attend to the wedding of an old friend, and had boarded the express at Goshen. While looking across the cold stretch of the misty river, he heard the steps and voices of 2 men approaching. They did not observe his presence in the gloom which enveloped the ferry slip, and paused close behind him. To their eyes there did not seem to be any one within earshot.
"Well, how did you succeed, Dexter?" said one of the men in a low tone which seemed to have a familiar intonation for Tuck. He thought he had heard it before, and, as it turned out, he was not mistaken. "Fine," was the reply. "I saw Judge Benson, and just as I thought, he's an old classmate of mine. That made things easier." "Well?" said his companion impatiently. "I found that 2 of the 5 judges are against the road, and that Benson himself has not yet come to the decision. Practically, he's still on the fence." "Cut it short," growled the other. "Did you make him see matters in the right light?" "I did," replied his companion, "but it'll cost you and your friends $10,000, Mr. Savage." "Broker Savage. I thought I knew that voice," was the reflection which passed through Tuck's mind when he heard the name uttered. "You shall have the money." "All right, I thought you'd agree, so I arranged to telegraph him the sum before 11 this morning." "You did right. You are certain, then, that this decision will go in the favor of the Chesapeake and Fairleigh?" "Yes, sir. He will hand down a written opinion against the Virginia Oil and Iron Company at 2 tomorrow." "Good. The railroad will then get complete control of the property." "I'm sure they will." "Unless—" "Unless what?" demanded Savage impatiently. "They carry the case to the Supreme Court of the United States." "You think the coal company will do that?" "I think it likely they will." "No matter. The decision will be of immense value to us just now in any case. I have an option on 20,500 shares of C&F at 16.5 with Bloodgood, Shipley and Company, which expires at 10:30 tomorrow. This is the block of stock I told you Duncan Jarrett has been trying to get a hold of so long, but could not. It would have given him the control of the road, but it will now do that for the opposition. I shall be elected president, and one of the schemes of my life will be realized." "I congratulate you, Mr. Savage. As for my fee of the service I have rendered to you, I leave that to the generosity of the gentlemen composing the clique," said the lawyer, rubbing his cold hands briskly together. "You shall be suitably rewarded, Mr. Dexter. Take my word for it." "Thank you. Of course you'll lose no time in taking up that option," suggested the lawyer. "It wouldn't do for that stock to slip through your fingers now." "No fear of that. If I should happen to be a few minutes late, Bloodgood will wait. He knows me, and the price closed this afternoon at 15 7/8. There'll be nothing doing in C&F until after the decision is known, so we are safe enough." "I dare say you know best." "Well, here comes the boat. You'll dine with me, of course, Mr. Dexter." The ferry boat bumped against the slip, and after the passengers had landed, Mr. Dexter and Broker Savage brushed past the indistinguishable form of George Tuck and boarded the boat. Tuck, observing that they crossed to the ladies' saloon, took the men's side so as to avoid a possible recognition. "This looks like a case of bribery, unless I'm much mistaken," muttered Tuck to himself. "I shall have to see Mr. Jarrett. If I could only forestall Mr. Savage and prevent him getting possession of that block of stock, I should be doing my wealthy patron a favor he will probably remember to my credit and advantage. But I'm afraid Mr. Savage will be on hand bright and early to take up his option." Next morning at 10 o'clock he was at Duncan Jarrett's office, only to learn that the gentleman was out of town, and no one in the office could say just when he might be expected to return. "Too bad," mused Tuck as he descended the steps to the sidewalk. "I guess I'll go over to Bloodgood's and see if Savage has taken up his option. It's nearly 11 o'clock. So Tuck crossed Wall Street and entered the office of his former boss. "Hello, Tuck," said Bloodgood genially as the boy broker was ushered into his private room. "How is business?" "I can't complain." "Made your fortune yet?" the broker inquired with a smile. "Not yet," grinned Tuck. "I'm shy about $600,000 of my first million yet." Do you mean to say that you're worth $400,000? asked Bloodgood in astonishment. Yes, and 10 or 12,000 over. You don't seem to have lost much time since you left our employ. I don't think I lost much time while I was in your employ either. No, Tuck, you were one of our gilt-edged clerks. We were sorry to lose you, but our loss seems to be your gain. Can I do anything for you this morning? I don't know, Mr. Bloodgood. Unless you can sell me some Chesapeake and Fairleigh, I should like to get a hold of about 20,000 shares. Should you indeed? Well, I have a block of 20,500 in which I have sold an option expiring today. I expect a gentleman at any moment after them. Then the option hasn't expired yet? Yes, it expired half an hour ago, but I always like to give a man a chance. Most brokers would be apt to take on a new customer if one appeared after the time limit had passed. That's right enough, nodded Bloodgood. But the option calls for 16.5, and the last quotation was 16, so you see it'll pay me to give my client a chance to come to the front if he wants the stock badly enough to pay the fraction. I've this advantage. I've got the only large block of CNF on the market. Well, Mr. Bloodgood, I want those shares badly enough to be willing to pay you 16 3/4 for the lot. The option having run out, why not close with me? It's spot cash. That certainly alters the situation. The stock is yours, Tuck. Deliver it at my office. It'll be paid for just as soon as I can get the money from the bank. I'll run over to your bank with you and make the exchange there. Where do you deposit? At Treadwell and Company. All right, that's only a step. He rang his bell. Tell Mr. Lynch to bring me those shares of Chesapeake and Fairleigh on which the option had just expired, he said to his office boy, who answered the summons. Just as the envelope containing the stock was placed in his hands, Broker Savage was announced. He followed close on the office boy's heels and came face to face with Tuck, who had started to leave the private office the moment he heard who the visitor was. Broker Savage scowled darkly when he recognized the boy, brushed rudely by him, and addressed himself to Mr. Bloodgood. I'll take that Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock now, Bloodgood, he said in his customary brusque way. I'm afraid you're too late, Savage, answered Bloodgood, evidently prepared for a ruction, for he knew the man he was dealing with. Too late? What do you mean? Your option expired 3/4 of an hour ago. If you had come any time up to 10 minutes ago, you could have had the stock. As it happens, I've just sold the block. Sold the block? Roared Savage. You have sold that stock? Yes, Mr. Savage, I sold it at 1/4 of a point advance on your offer. Thunder and lightning, howled the stout broker so furiously that his voice could be heard out to the reception room. Who'd you sell it to? Mr. George Tuck. Tuck! Tuck! I don't know any broker by that name, snorted Savage. You passed him this moment you came in here. Do you mean that boy? Asked the broker contemptuously. I do. That is George Tuck, one of our most successful young brokers. Rot, retorted Mr. Savage rudely. He purchased the stock for $343,375 cash. Do you expect me to believe that fiction, sir? I am not accustomed to lying in matters of business, Mr. Savage, replied Broker Bloodgood sternly, thoroughly disgusted with the uncouth behavior of his visitor. Savage regarded him with a furious glare. Then he blurted out, This is a put-up job. Are you aware, sir, that your language is insulting? You might have waited an hour at least, snarled Savage. You know who I am. I contracted to take that stock, and I intended to do so. How could I tell that, when you failed to call on time, Mr. Savage? The stock was quoted on the ticker an hour ago at 16, which is 1/2 point lower than your option called for. Might I not reasonably presume by your failure to appear at 10:30 that you did not intend to pay that extra $half a share, which on the 20,500 shares amounts to over $10,000? According to the rules, I was in no way bound to hold the stock a moment after 10:30 if I found a customer for it. As it happened, Mr. Tuck came in here and asked me if I had any of the stock. He offered me 16 3/4, and I sold it to him. That's all there is to it. Mr. Savage turned on his heel and walked out into the reception room, followed by Mr. Bloodgood, after he had put his hat and coat on. Chapter 13, in which Tuck walks into a trap. The irate broker walked up to Tuck, who was standing by the window waiting for Mr. Bloodgood to join him.
did you buy that block of Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock?" he roared into the boy's ear. "Yes, sir," replied Tuck, wheeling about and looking him squarely in the eye. "What did you want with it?" "Excuse me, sir, but I don't think it's anybody's business but my own." "You don't, do you? I say it's my business, you little jackanapes." "I have no wish to talk to you on the subject, Mr. Savage," answered Tuck coolly. "But I propose to talk with you, you little monkey. Who'd you buy it for?" "I decline to tell you." "I insist on knowing," howled Savage in a tone which caused every clerk in the place to get interested in the discussion. "Mr. Bloodgood, are you ready?" asked Tuck, walking up to his old boss. "I want you to answer me, confound you!" roared Broker Savage, catching the boy by the arm. "Take your hand from my arm, please," demanded Tuck, in a tone which unconsciously had an effect on the stout broker, for he released the boy. "Will you sell me that stock at a quarter advance on what you gave for it?" Savage said, although it was like pulling teeth for him to make this offer, but he had sense enough to see that the boy had the best of the argument. "No, sir, I will not." "Don't you know that's a full point ahead of the market price?" "I'm not denying but it may be." "What will you sell it for?" "It is not for sale at this moment." "What do you mean, you whippersnapper?" roared Broker Savage with a venomous glance at the boy. "I said it was not for sale, and I think that's all that is necessary for me to say." "You mean you won't sell it to me?" "I'm not offering it to anybody," replied Tuck, turning away. "Look here, young man, I offer you 17.5 for that block of stock, and I want it delivered to my office not later than 2 o'clock. If you fail to be on hand with it, I promise this will be the worst day's work you ever did in your life." Broker Savage uttered this threat in no uncertain terms, and the malignant look which accompanied the words showed that he was not to be trifled with. Clearly Mr. Savage was determined to get the stock in his possession, or there promised to be trouble. George Tuck, however, was not a boy to be easily frightened into doing something against his will. "Look here, Mr. Savage," retorted the boy broker in a low, tense tone, intended for the stockbroker's ear only. "You had better not threaten me. Do you understand? I happen to know why you want that block of stock so badly. Those shares would give the clique you represent control of the company and pave the way to your election to the presidency. You expect that a certain judge of the Virginia Court of Appeals will hand down a decision at 2 o'clock this afternoon, favorable to the railroad company in its suit against the Virginia Coal and Iron Company. Perhaps you are not aware," sarcastically, "that somebody has sent this judge in question $10,000 for the purpose of influencing his decision. That looks very much as if there was bribery in the background, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if a New York lawyer by the name of Dexter could throw some light on the subject if the matter should happen to be investigated." To say that Broker Savage was fairly staggered by this unexpected revelation on the part of the boy he hated would be telling nothing short of the truth. With bulging eyes and parted lips he watched Tuck and Mr. Bloodgood leave the office, and then, with a snarl, not unmixed with a cold shiver as to possible future developments, he followed them and went directly to his own office. For the next 15 minutes he was busy calling up diverse parties on his telephone. Later on he had a number of rather excited callers who were closeted with him for some time in his private room. Then the conference broke up. The gentlemen were dismissed by a private door into the main corridor, and Mr. Savage, with a look of determination on his face, put on his hat and overcoat, and left the office himself, leaving word that he would not be back again that day. In the meantime, Tuck paid for and got possession of the 20,500 shares of Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock, took them over to his office, and put them in his safe. It had taken the greater part of his bank account to put the deal through, but he felt reasonably sure that Duncan Jarrett would gladly take them off his hands at the price he paid for the shares plus his commission. In any case, he believed that as soon as the decision of the Virginia Court of Appeals was known to be favorable to the Chesapeake and Fairleigh Railroad, the price would advance on the exchange. That afternoon he was honored by a visit from Miss Laura Joyce and her friend Mira Clark. They spent a very pleasant half-hour with him, and then the three walked across the corridor and surprised Nicholas Knipp in his new suite of offices, which the girls declared to be just lovely. Miss Clark had been persuaded by Laura to try her luck in Wall Street, and she had brought with her $1,000, which he asked Mr. Nip to invest for her as he thought best. Of course, Nip was delighted at this bit of confidence on the part of his fair charmer, and he resolved he would see her through successfully if it cost him a pretty penny himself to do it. This meant that Nicholas Nip was rather smitten with the pretty young miss. That evening, when Nip and Tuck closed their offices and started uptown by the Underground Railway, they were followed by a couple of well-dressed but rather hard-looking individuals. That Nip had no share in their attention was shown by the fact that both of them alighted at 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, where Tuck left the train. They shadowed him to his home from there. Making sure they would know the house again, they passed up on 7th Avenue and walked down to 125th Street, where they entered a saloon near the Harlem Opera House. Taking seats at one of the polished round tables, they ordered a succession of drinks and cigars, and put in an hour in a manner apparently agreeable to themselves. About this time a carriage stopped in front of the saloon. The driver dismounted from his perch and entered the place. He called for a drink at the bar, then looked about the saloon, as if in search of someone. He looked at the two men who had been so long seated at the table and made a sign to them, which they evidently understood, for they followed him out to the sidewalk. One of them mounted beside the driver, and the other got into the carriage. Then the vehicle drove off. It came to a halt in front of the brownstone house where Tuck and his parents lived. The man got outside, went up the steps, and rang the bell. "Mr. George Tuck in?" he inquired of the girl who answered the ring.
"Yes, sir."
"Please hand him this letter."
"Will you step inside, sir?"
The man did so and waited in the hall while the girl was absent. Tuck came upstairs from the basement where he had been finishing his supper. The open note he held in his hand read as follows: "My dear Tuck, I wish to see you at my house this evening on a matter of the greatest importance and send my carriage to fetch you. I have only just returned from Philadelphia and expect to go to Boston by the midnight train. Sincerely yours, Duncan Jarrett." "Mr. Jarrett will only detain you half an hour," said the man who stood in the hall. "The carriage is outside."
"Very well," replied Tuck, unsuspicious that anything was wrong about this invitation from the millionaire operator, whom he was eager to acquaint with the information that he had bought the block of Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock which would give him control of the road. "I'll be ready in a moment." He took his hat and overcoat from the rack and put them on. Then he ran downstairs and told his father he had an engagement with Mr. Jarrett, handing him the note by way of explanation. Then he rejoined the man in the hall above, who, with a covert smile of satisfaction, led the way to the carriage and held the door open for him to enter.
Chapter 14. Nip's Unexpected Introduction into an Old House in the Bronx. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, the night was dark, blustering and cold, and Nicholas Nip, who had attended a smoker of the Trident Yacht Club on the Harlem River, was returning home on foot up 161st Street, expecting every moment to be overtaken by a car. When he was passing a big, gloomy building, his attention was attracted to a glittering spark which scintillated on the doorstep of the house. He stopped, looked more keenly at the object, and then, filled with curiosity, walked over and picked it up. "I believe it's a diamond ornament," he exclaimed to himself. "It's lucky to find anything on the street. The more valuable the object, the more lucky you are." He took out his pocket matchbox, extracted a match, took a couple of steps along the front of the building, and extended his hand to strike a light as to examine his find. "Good gracious!" exclaimed the boy broker, as the flickering flame revealed a handsome gold and diamond-encrusted watch charm. The initials G.T. were enameled on one side. "This is the counterpart in every way to Tuck's. The same initials, too. What a coincidence!" Then, as the match gave an expiring flash and went out, something happened. Nip stepped on the flap which covered the opening into the cellar. The rotten wood gave way without the slightest warning, and the boy shot down into the dark depths below, alighting on an earthy floor all in a heap. Although not injured in the least, he was pretty badly shaken up, and for a moment it almost seemed to him as if the house had fallen upon him. "Gee whiz!" he ejaculated when he pulled himself together. "Where am I at? I could not have done that slicker if I had been acting in a pantomime and had gone through a star trap in the stage. It's lucky I didn't break my neck." Calling his matchbox into requisition once more, he struck a light and looked about him. Nip found himself in a mouldy-looking space directly beneath the wooden sidewalk, which connected with the basement of the building through a couple of mildewed arches. The break through which he had fallen was more than 10 feet above his head, and there appeared to be no means at hand by which he could get within reaching distance of the hole. "This is a nice predicament, I must say," grumbled Nip, as the unpromising conditions presented themselves to his mind. "Must find some other way of getting out." The only other way seemed to mean that he would have to penetrate the cellar and try to reach the ground floor above. This accomplished, he would probably manage to break out through a door or window. He put his plan into practice at once. The basement was littered with all kinds of debris, over which he stumbled with the aid of lighted matches. Not a very satisfactory kind of illumination, it must be admitted, but certainly better than nothing. The dust, the grime, and cobwebs of months, perhaps years, confronted him at every step. "A beastly place," was his comment, and it was, for a fact. Accidentally stepping on a stout hoop which had once upon a time encircled a big barrel, it flew up and gave him a rap on the hand, skinning his knuckles. "Wow!" he exclaimed as the match in his fingers flew a yard away. As he paused to nurse his injured digits, he fancied he heard the sound of voices not far away. He listened intently in the darkness, and soon became assured that he had not been mistaken. "Must be cautious," he muttered. "Persons making free with an old building at this hour of the morning are not to be depended on. I shouldn't want to run against a gang of crooks. They might handle me roughly, not to speak of their getting away with my watch and other valuables." Nip picked his way into the passage at one side of the cellar, and every step he took brought the sounds more distinctly to his ears. Then he saw a dim light shining through the space at the bottom of what he judged to be a doorway on the other side of the passage. "I don't think I'll bother to find out what's going on in there," he muttered. "It's none of my business, and I'm not looking for trouble just now." He cautiously struck another match on his trousers leg, and by the light saw a rickety wooden stairway close at hand. His purpose was to mount it as lightly as possible, but his plan was suddenly frustrated by the unexpected appearance of somebody with a flickering candle in his hand at the head of the stairs. A gleam of light striking him in the face, he turned to find that the displaced brick gave him a full view of the cellar room whence the sound of talking had issued, and what he saw surprised and startled him. It was a small enclosure, not over 8 feet square, almost as dirty and littered with rubbish as the more open part of the cellar. A common wide-bellied oil lamp stood on a box, and this served to light the whole fairly well. Seated on a box beside the far wall from Nip, with his hands bound behind him and secured to an upright beam, was George Tuck, cool and defiant. Facing him in the middle of the room was the burly figure of Roger Savage, the Wall Street broker. "You don't seem to realize, young man, that I hold all the cards in the deck. Not a soul who has any interest in you can ever glean the slightest knowledge of your whereabouts as long as you remain in the basement of this building. I doubt much if even the police could trace you here, as I can easily send them on a false scent. You had better come to terms. All I ask of you is the Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock at the price mentioned in my option given by Bloodgood, and your solemn promise never to mention your suspicions concerning Mr. Dexter or Judge Benson, who wrote the decision sustaining the verdict of the Virginia Supreme Court in the case of the railroad against the coal company, or the action I've been forced to take against you tonight on behalf of myself and the other gentlemen to whose interest you are a menace." "I decline to make any terms with you whatever, Mr. Savage," said Tuck resolutely. "You had better think again, George Tuck," said the broker grimly. "This won't be a pleasant place for you to put in the winter, but here you'll stay till you agree to do as I wish." "I'll stay here, then," retorted Tuck stubbornly. "I may be in your power now, but I doubt much if I will remain so." "You're a fool," snarled the broker angrily. "Not half the fool you are for what you've done tonight, for this will be enough to demoralize what little reputation you have in the street." "What do you mean, you whippersnapper? Do you dare say that I don't stand as high as any broker in Wall Street?" "I'd sooner have the little reputation I've acquired in the last few months since I've branched out as a broker than all the credit you've established for yourself as a tricky operator since you came into the street." "How dare you talk to me in that fashion, you little monkey?" cried Savage furiously. "Because you can't prevent me from telling the truth." It looked for a moment as if the burly broker intended to strike the defenseless boy with his clenched fist, for he raised his arm menacingly and took a step forward. But if such a thought had been in his mind, he reconsidered it, for he stepped back again with a metallic laugh. "And you refuse the terms I offer you, eh?" he said in a nasty tone. "I do, and I defy you to do your worst." "You talk like a hero of a novel, young man," said the broker sneeringly. "You will alter your tune after you have had a taste of the physic I've prepared for you." With a glare of hatred, Broker Savage picked up the lamp, turned on his heel, and left the place, leaving the boy broker in solitude and darkness. "If that doesn't tame him, I shall be mightily surprised," growled the broker to the man who had come downstairs with a candle. "Put the padlock on. I'll come again in the morning. You and Blazer can make yourself comfortable for the night here, I guess. It isn't likely you'll be troubled by visitors." "Not likely," replied the man with a confident grin. "I'd like to know who'd come here." "That's right," nodded the broker. "He's safe enough. I'll break his spirit before I've done with him." The worthy pair then ascended the stairs, and presently Nip heard them walking around overhead. But it was not many minutes before silence fell over the house. Chapter 15. Nip helps Tuck out of a tight place. What Tuck's thoughts were after the door was padlocked upon him, and he heard the steps of his enemy die away up the stairway, may be better imagined than described. They certainly could not have been of a cheerful character. He did not dream for an instant that there was help at hand within a few feet of him, that Nip, his business rival but staunch friend for all that, was within hail he could have regarded as a ridiculous supposition, had such a thought occurred to him. He believed, as anyone in his circumstances would have believed, that he was alone and quite helpless in the power of a desperate man, whose business reputation and security, even from arrest, depended on the silencing of the young broker, either by forcing the boy to give his solemn promise to remain silent on a matter which implicated him, or by keeping him in indefinite confinement. Tuck, however, was made of stuff not easily bent to suit other people's purposes, and especially was he antagonistic to Broker Savage, for whom he had but little respect since the man had tried to walk over him roughshod in front of the exchange, and now he had far better reasons for despising him. While Nip had no plan at all looking toward the release of his friend, he determined to commence operations by opening up communication with him. Putting his mouth to the opening, he called, "Tuck!" There was a sudden movement inside, as if the prisoner had been startled by the hail and was wondering whence it came. "Tuck!" he mildly shouted again. "Who's that?" came back the answer. "It happens to be your old friend Nip." "What?" ejaculated Tuck in utter amazement. "Say that again." "I'm Nip, all right, but unfortunately there's a stone wall between us." "Great Scott! Is it really you, Nip?" "That's who it is." "I recognize your voice now, but for heaven's sake, how came you to track me here?" "I didn't," replied Nip. "If you hadn't lost your watch charm on the doorstep of this building, I should not have been here now, but home in bed." "I wasn't aware I'd lost it, but I see I have." "I was out to a smoker at the Trident Club and was walking up the street, there not being a car in sight, when I saw the glitter of the diamonds in your charm. I stopped to investigate, picking it up, and while examining it, I broke through the opening into this cellar, and here I am." "Well, Nip, how are you going to help me out of here? I'm bound tightly to a stanchion, and the door is padlocked." "Probably the best thing I could do, as there is no intention on the part of your enemies to molest you again tonight, is for me to make my way out of here myself, go to the precinct station on 3rd Avenue and report the fix you're in. Officers will be sent here to release you at once and arrest whoever is found in the building." "All right, Nip. Do as you think best. Now that I have a friend on the outside who knows my predicament, I don't mind the darkness and confinement for a cent. I'd rather get you out myself if I could find any way to accomplish the job. I don't see how you can get over the padlock. I'm going to take a look at the door at any rate." Nip left his position under the staircase and went around to the door. The space within which Tuck was confined was formed by a plain wooden partition. The door was made of 4 links of the same material, held together by 2 cross pieces, and worked at a couple of big hinges. It was secured by a hasp and a common padlock. "If I could find a stout bit of iron, I could easily force the hasp off," said Nip to himself, as the second match expired in his fingers. "It is a flimsy affair." He made a torch of part of an old newspaper he saw lying on the floor, and returned to the main cellar to see if he could find anything strong enough to answer his purpose. After a patient search, he discovered an old axe handle, Using all of his strength after he had inserted one end of the handle between the hasp and the door, he gradually forced out one of the staples, a feat he could scarcely have accomplished if the sharp ends had been bent on the inside, as generally is the case. As soon as the hasp fell to one side, there was nothing to hold the door, so Nip promptly pulled it open and walked into Tuck's prison pen. Then he struck another match, yanked out the stout jackknife he always carried about with him, and in a moment more Tuck was free. The match went out, and the two boys clasped hands in the darkness. "Next to a kind of providence, Nip, I owe my release to you." "Don't let the fact worry you, Tuck," replied Nip heartily. "Well, I shan't forget it. You may depend on that." "Let's be jogging along. I don't see any fun remaining down in this filthy cellar." "Well, I hope we won't be stopped by the two fellows whom I suppose have been left to see that I did not get away." "Aren't we a match for any two ordinary men, Tuck?" "I guess we can put up a pretty stiff fight with our fists, but those chaps are probably heeled. Such men usually are. And I don't fancy running against a bullet if there's any way of avoiding it." "That's right. Perhaps you want to get the chaps pulled in, then go for Savage for all you're worth. You ought to be able to put him out of the street for good, not to speak of landing him in the Tombs for this night's work." The two boys ascended the cellar stairs and reached a sort of corridor, where they paused for a moment to reconnoiter. The sound of heavy breathing out of the darkness on one side was pretty good evidence that Broker Savage's accomplices were asleep. "Good," whispered Nip. "Take off your shoes, Tuck. We don't want to disturb these fellows' rest. We'll leave that to the police of the precinct." With that he squatted down and removed his footgear, and Tuck followed his example in silence. They crept toward the front of the building, but found the street door locked. They were hardly surprised at this. "Come up to the next floor," suggested Nip. They went, found a window in the back without a pane or sash, and let themselves drop to the ground outside. Resuming their shoes, they made their way with all haste to the precinct station on 3rd Avenue, and the result of the interview with the man at the desk was that 3 officers were sent with the boys to the old building. Entrance was effected from the rear, and the sleepers were aroused in no gentle manner and taken to the station, where they were locked up in cells below. Chapter 16. Nip and Tuck Combine in Business. The first thing Tuck did next morning was to visit a magistrate and swear out a warrant for Roger Savage. Accompanied by a plainclothes man, Tuck went to the neighborhood of the deserted building and waited for the broker to make his appearance, as he had intimated he would. Between 9 and 10 o'clock, Mr. Savage was seen coming down 161st Street from the direction of 3rd Avenue. "Are you Mr. Roger Savage of 69 Wall Street?" asked the officer. "I don't know you, sir," said the operator brusquely. "You haven't answered my question," persisted the detective. "Well, I am Mr. Savage. What then?" "I have a warrant for your arrest, and shall have to ask you to accompany me to the station." "What?" exclaimed the stout broker in a blustering tone. "I guess you made a mistake in your man." "No mistake at all, Mr. Savage," said the voice of George Tuck. The operator staggered back as if he had been struck a blow. "You here?" "Yes, sir," replied the boy cheerfully. "Now I think I'll treat you to a dose of your own medicine. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander." The detective drew out of his pocket a pair of steel bracelets, and at the sight of them the haughty broker collapsed completely. 15 minutes later he was in a cell at the station. Subsequently he was taken before a magistrate and remanded, and later in the day he was conveyed down to the Tombs. Next morning he was brought up for examination, which, by advice of counsel, he waived, and was then admitted to bail. The afternoon papers had a story of the kidnapping of George Tuck, though the young broker made no statement as to the stout broker's object. The affair set Wall Street to talking, and Tuck held a sort of levee at his office after the exchange closed for the day. The legal victory of the Chesapeake and Fairleigh Railroad sent the stock of that company up to 20. There was little of the stock in the market, chiefly small lots which passed from hand to hand. The bulk of the stock was in the hands of either the Savage clique or the Jarrett combine, neither, however, having actually acquired control. Both had been after the block of 20,500 shares, now in Tuck's possession, which had been held for a long time by an old gentleman named Davis, whose death had thrown it into the hands of Bloodgood, Shipley and Company for sale. This fact having been discovered early by Roger Savage, he had bought an option on it, pending the decision of the Virginia Court of Appeals. 4 days later, Duncan Jarrett returned to New York, and Tuck called at his office and offered him the block of Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock at the market price, which was now 26 3/4. It is needless to say that though the price had gone up a matter of 11 points since Mr. Jarrett had left the city, and the advance represented nearly $250,000, he was delighted to get hold of the shares. He and his associates would now come into control of the road, as well as a valuable concession which had been claimed by the Virginia Coal and Iron Company. The sale netted Tuck $205,000, raising his bank balance to $665,000. Nip, on Tuck's advice, had bought all the Chesapeake and Fairleigh stock he could get a hold of, something like 5,000 shares at an average price of $22, and held on to it for a further rise. The day after Tuck sold the block of stock to Mr. Jarrett, the grand jury handed in an indictment against Roger Savage for kidnapping and assault, and he was rearrested and compelled to give much larger bail pending his trial. His 2 accomplices had also been let out on bail, furnished through business associates of Mr. Savage. But when the indictments were found against them, they could not be located. When their names were called in court, they failed to respond. Consequently, their bail was forfeited, and detectives were sent out to look them up. The Christmas holidays came and passed. On the 3rd of January, it was announced in the newspapers that at the annual meeting of the Chesapeake and Fairleigh Railroad Company, a new board of directors had been chosen, who in turn elected Duncan Jarrett president of the road. Next day, Nip unloaded his CNF holdings at $8 a share, clearing something over $40,000 on the deal. The combined profits of Nip and Tuck, the boy brokers, since they had gone into business on their own hook, now amounted to over $1 million, a very handsome showing, especially when it is considered that their combined capital at starting was less than $10,000 cash. Soon after the change of management in the CNF, Nip and Tuck simultaneously noticed a stiffening of Chesapeake and Ohio stock on the market. This stock had been depressed by a bear click some little time before, and was selling around 49. Both boys put on their thinking caps, and the result of their deliberations was that both of them, without the other's knowledge, began buying C&O at 50. They had each accumulated about 15,000 shares on the margin deal, when the news came out in the public prints that the C&O had leased the Chesapeake and Fairleigh Road, and that an arrangement had been entered into with the Virginia Coal and Iron Company by which further litigation would be avoided and the C&O would come into possession of valuable privileges. This announcement, even before confirmation, caused a boom in C&O stock, and brokers on the floor of the exchange fought each other to get some of it. C&O rapidly advanced from 52 to 60, with every indication that the price would run much higher. Other rumors regarding the advantages of this arrangement between C&O and the VC&I Company sent the stock towards 70, and both Nip and Tuck saw another rich haul in sight for them. About this time the trial of Roger Savage came on, and of course George Tuck was the main witness against the broker. Savage had been confident of breaking down the evidence of the boy for want of corroboration. He and his lawyers, eminent counsel by the way, had not the slightest suspicion that Nicholas Nip had any connection with the case. Tuck had been exceedingly close-mouthed with the reporters, and the fact that Nip had gone before the grand jury was not known outside the district attorney's office. The result was that after Tuck had gone on the stand and testified, and had been badgered and bully-ragged by the lawyers for the defense, without, however, materially weakening his evidence, Nip was produced, and what he had to say under oath was a complete surprise to the prisoner and his counsel. The jury was not long in returning a verdict of guilty against the stout man, and he was sent to a cell in the Tombs. Bail was placed at a large amount, but he got it, pending an appeal from the trial court. Enough came out of the trial to make very unpleasant reading in the report of the case in the papers, for Lawyer Dexter and the Virginia judge both had their integrity assailed. Eventually the verdict was sustained, and Broker Savage had to go to Sing Sing, but money and a powerful pull got him pardoned inside of a year. Nip and Tuck cleaned up $500,000 between them out of the C&O boom, besides making several $1,000s for the Mrs. Laura Joyce and Mira Clark. That the two girls appreciated the smartness as well as the personal advantages of the young brokers may be assumed, for it shortly afterward became known among the friends of each that Tuck was engaged to Laura, and Nip to Mira. After the trial of Roger Savage, Tuck proposed to Nip that they go into partnership. To this proposal Nip immediately agreed, and 1 week later the offices were combined, and the new sign which at once appeared on the bulletin board of the New Era building read, Nip and Tuck, Stocks and Bonds. The end. End of Chapter 16. End of Fame and Fortune Weekly, number 9. Published by Frank Towsey. Recording by Keith Salas.